don't know, man. I like street work more.
You'd rather sit in a surveillance van days on end waiting to catch Tater handing Pee-wee a vial? This, detective, is what you're telling me? A case like this here, where you show who gets paid behind all the tragedy and the fraud, where you show how the money routes itself, how we're all of us vested, all of us complicit.
Career case, huh?
Baby, I could die happy.
When you walk through the garden, gotta watch your back. Well, I beg your pardon. Walk the straight and narrow track. If you walk
Alex Cottrell and Toby Huntingford present Caught on the Wire. This podcast is an episode-by-episode analysis of HBO's widely acclaimed TV series about the city of Baltimore, its people, and its many problems. Find more information about the show and all the episodes online at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com. Hi there, welcome back to Caught on the Wire. It's me, Alex. I'm here with Toby, as usual. We're taking a look this week at Season 5, Episode 2, Unconfirmed Reports. And I think considering how much we've got to look at in this episode, I think I'll jump straight into our listeners' corner. And we got a couple of messages this week, didn't we, Toby?
Oh, yep. We heard from our regulars, Damon, and from Gil, and Dan as well, was it?
Yeah.
Should we hear what they have to say?
I'll take a look at Dan's email first here. Just commenting about it being season 5 already, which we were saying only last week that it's crazy to think how close we are to the end now. Both a good thing to see it all completed, and a bit of a shame as well, obviously, for it to come to an end. So he takes a look at season 5 here in his email, and it says a couple of bits about the season in general. So the first point that he makes, in regards to the 10 episodes, the interview with David Simon, which he sent a link to us a few weeks ago, he says it seems to indicate there was a bit of back and forth in terms of working out the show's length, with Simon not necessarily feeling like he needed 11 or 12 episodes in the first place. He seems to give the impression that HBO were generally quite flexible and accommodating of what he needed. But this season does seem to fly by, though, and on balance, I do really like it. I think everything with Marlo and Propjo is excellent. I really like the Baltimore Sun characters, Gus in particular. Michael and Dukie's stories are really strong, and of course Bubble's final arc is terrific. It's only really the serial killer stuff that feels less engrossing to me, particularly in the first half of the season. Overall, it's still great. The last couple of episodes are up there with the strongest in the whole show, in my opinion, and the ending of the show is really well delivered. Dan also talks a little bit about the music. He says, a quick word on the music. I think you'll both disagree with me here. He says that his favourite version of the theme from a musical perspective is Season 3. He says he really likes the various layers of percussion and vocals and the general raw, chaotic vibe created by the Neville brothers. And some love for Season 4 too, performed by, is it Domaje or Do?
I think it's Domaje, yeah.
Domaje. It says they're a group of Baltimore teenage singers, and it was created specifically for the show. And I think it fits really nicely with this season's focus on the younger Baltimore generation. Dan says that his least favourite is the season 5 theme, as he says he finds Steve Earle's version quite one-dimensional and just too polished. So yeah, it's very different comments to what we made last week.
Yeah, it's what we love.
But the beauty of getting other people's perspectives on it, which is great. So makes the third and final point here. He says, this one is cheating slightly as I'm a few episodes ahead of you guys. A few weeks ago I emailed about Chris and Snoop leaving Michael's dad's body in the alley rather than in a vacant, but as you rightly pointed out, it would make sense that they would end up disposing of the body in the usual manner. We just don't see it. However, when Bunk is cracking the case later in this season, it is mentioned as being an alley beating and probably unrelated to the vacant murders, so it does seem as though his body was left in the streets and not boarded up with the others. I feel this does re-raise the question of Chris's misstep and the possibility that Marlo was not made aware of how the body was left. Would be intriguing to get your thoughts on this when we reach that moment later on in this season. Yeah, very good point there. We'll have to keep an eye out for that when Bunker's kind of getting to the closing stages of the case at the end of the season. I must admit that I had not really thought of that, so slipped my mind.
Perhaps Chris thought that Michael's stepdad wasn't worthy of a proper burial. So we'll have to, but yeah, we'll look forward to properly sort of concluding that theory in a few episodes' time.
Yeah, sort of. It's almost as if by putting them in the vacants, that's their way of almost honouring them.
Yeah, and there was that one
it's
scene
almost like
where
you are lucky to have been sacrificed by, the sacred duo.
Yeah, because of course there's that side-by-side eulogy that they give for one of the New York boys that they put in the vacants. Next to Forster's. So that there is some sort of honour that goes on, well, as far as they're concerned, in their rituals in the vacants, I guess. So that's certainly one nice way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for your comments, Dan. All really appreciate and some really interesting stuff there. And we'll move on now to Gil, who has contacted us a few times before as well. Just checking in from New York City. Says that he's on holiday / Thanksgiving eating extravaganza. Says that he enjoyed the first episode we did for season 5 and makes a couple of quick notes. Firstly, he says he'd like to connect the title, More with Less, from last week, to the show's need to do a huge amount of fresh storytelling, as well as a series wrapping up with fewer episodes than usual. Simon hasn't come out to criticise HBO for their slim order, as he's even defended it, but it's clear that these seasons suffered a little for not being able to develop some of the storylines over a few more scenes. Even the serial killer story could have been justified with more careful exploration. Second point, he says, since you talked about the integrity of the newsroom coverage, I thought I'd mention, in case you don't already know, that Tom McCarthy, the actor who plays Templeton, has become a notable film director, and he has a brand new film called Spotlight, which I saw while in NYC, about the Boston Globe's prolonged investigation into the Catholic Church paedophilia cover-up scandal. It seems similarly accurate and honest, and was a very Wire-esque, straightforward narrative with very little trumped-up drama. I've looked around for fact-checkers calling out any inaccuracies but can't find anything. Great film and highly recommended for viewers of The Wire. So that's Spotlight, a film by Todd McCarthy, who plays Templeton.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any of Tom McCarthy's work. I know he was quite famously directing The Station Agent as well, which I'm yet to see. So I didn't bring that up last week, really, because I'm just not really too familiar with him beyond The Wire, so... But yeah, cheers for that, and I've heard very good things about Spotlight, another one that I would like to see.
He's in 2012.
Oh, the BBC series?
No, the terrible
film.
that
terrible... Yeah, that really famously awful Roland Emmerich disaster classic thing, yeah, I mean...
He was in Meet the Parents, Todd McCarthy.
Okay, so yeah, he's really gotten around, hasn't he? It's a shame that I never had that moment
because that's
like
before
I did with...
The Wire.
What's that, sorry?
That's before The Wire.
Yeah, I mean, he's...
Meet the Parents, that's like 2000.
Yeah, he seems to have been around for a while. It's a shame I didn't have that moment like I did with Clever Now, where you go, oh, it's you! Like, I guess most people would have done. So...
It's quite a varied career by the looks of things.
Yeah.
So, yeah, interesting. Anyway, back to Gil's email. And he mentions a bit about Season 5 in general. He says that subsequent viewings have definitely elevated it for me. The unconvincing serial killer storyline recedes while the season has become the epic story of Marlo in my mind, which ranks it very close to 2, 3 and 4 in quality. I also really enjoy the newspaper storyline and setting, so that helps. Hope all's well in the UK. Back soon, let me know if you want to grab that pint, he says. We'll have to maybe have a... Wire meet-up.
It can be done.
Your place, Toby. You're the one in London.
We'll find one of the many pubs, one of the many great pubs around the glorious city. Thanks for that, Gil. Always good to hear from you. And Damon, I believe, has got something to say as well. Is that right?
Yeah, a die-hard podcast listener.
Yeah.
he brings us a very interesting random factoid, saying the girl Michael is having sex with in the last episode, that is Quanice Jenkins, the girl all the boys are talking about on the stoop earlier in the season. They're all sitting around talking about how hot she is. Also, I never got why was Dukey to switch to high school in what seemed like the middle of the school year. Was that meant to be a new school year already? So yeah, the first point that he makes about Quanice Jenkins is interesting. It's Quanice Davis that they say in the episode. But if it is actually the same girl that Michael is having sex with, then that's a very, very interesting connection to kind of
really cool if that is the
slot those
case.
two together.
I haven't heard that one before, and I'm very intrigued to hear it from Damon.
I don't know if it's from one of the scripts or something like that.
Yeah,
I can't. After a sort of cursory Google search, I couldn't find anything like that at all. But Damon is clearly a man on the inside. So
because obviously I remember the scene where she's sort of circle jerked over in episode 2, but I assume that she was she was kind of a heard but not seen character. But perhaps I don't think Michael quotes her name, does he, in that scene where they're in bed? So
possibly. Don't know. Can't remember off the top of my head.
We'll have to go and watch it, I think. But it's a really cool idea. I'd love it because obviously that it goes from the fantasy to the reality for Michael, really kind of echoing his ascent up the.
Yeah, definitely.
So if that is, it's certainly a cool link if it was intended.
Completing the world as well, just kind of like it's almost like no characters are wasted. No one is ever very few people are genuinely in the background and are never seen again. There's just that decent consistency amongst even some of the, like for example the lady in Homicide who eyes up Jimmy that one time, and she appears multiple times throughout the show. So never has any speaking lines as far as I can remember.
This episode's actually one of the very few that breaks that rule, where there's that sort of plot device-y county homicide lady who is like instrumental in giving Jimmy the motive for the homeless killings, but because she never comes back, does she? She's literally just there as a plot device. That's one of the major complaints in this particular episode in relation to season 5, I guess. Yeah. In this episode, anyway. So that's one of the few times where the character doesn't really have a wider purpose. So. Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, that's all of our messages that we got this week via email. Thanks, Damon and Gil and Dan, for getting in touch. Good to hear from you guys, and keep in touch throughout the rest of season 5. So if we move on to the recap then.
He's got the fire and the fury.
Alrighty, it's my turn. I'm looking forward to this. We have not an overwhelming number of sections. We're going to go and visit Bubbles, the Davis detail, which is a new strand for us. The Stanfield organisation, as always, the politics, the Baltimore Sun, and the Homicide unit. None of these are overwhelmingly large. Homicide's the largest. We'll save it for the end. We'll kick off with Bubbles, though. We finished with him last week, so let's pick up where we left off. And the opening scene. So, a recovering drug addict named Dee Dee talks about her addiction at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. She describes how her addiction caused her to break many of the rules she once set for herself, driving her as low as prostitution. Walon chairs the meeting and Bubbles is also in attendance. Walon calls upon him to speak because they have spare time. He relates that he's 15 months clean. Bubbles amuses the assembly by describing the dope fiend lean, a stance he would adopt while high. He is unable to talk about his deeper feelings and his lowest point, so he leaves the floor. Walon next calls up an addict named Marvin to speak. After the meeting, Walon congratulates Bubbles for his humour and then chastises him for not continuing. He explains that the humour is secondary to the truths. Walon mentions the possibility of Bubbles discussing Sherrod, and Bubbles instantly turns away from him. Walon holds Bubbles and reminds him that he is supposed to pursue a searching and fearless moral inventory. Bubbles tells him that he lives with his actions every day. Walon tells Bubbles that he must let his feelings out before letting them go. Walon then tells Bubbles that he must allow himself to feel the pain of his regret, and that a lack of feeling was never his problem. So it's getting pretty deep very early on here. It
is, yeah. We kind of start off with Dee Dee, who is a character we've seen a couple of times now, and this is kind of the last part of the show that she stars in as part of this Narcotics Anonymous area. I think the first time we see her is in Amsterdam.
That's right.
I believe.
It's middle of season 3. And she appears to be sort of a fairly wealthy suburban style lady who's just driven down to the ghetto for some drugs. But and then we see her at her low point, the prostitution that she speaks of in season 4.
That's right.
Bunk is leering at her at that moment. And now we see her again in her final sort of segment. We also learn her name for the first time, obviously, with the benefit of hindsight and the internet. We learnt it before actually knowing her name on the show. But yeah, they kind of close off her story and give a lot more detail than the glimpses we'd seen so far.
This minor success story and arc hidden behind the major elements of the show, which is nice.
Yeah, and
so we start off with her talking about like this darkness of addiction inside her, and she's obviously being very candid about her lowest points, which Bubbles is not so much. Can't quite bring himself to fully share how low he went, which is a good starting point dramatically, because it brings us up to the well-known scene in episode 9, Late Editions, where he finally opens up about Sherrod.
Yeah, it's like, in terms of that progression, it's one of the few arcs that's told pretty conventionally on the show, isn't it? There's a setup here where we see Bubs ain't quite in the right place, and then of course we can assume he'll come back at season's end having made the transition he needs to speak out about this guilt. And I guess the thing The Wire has on its side is its past lessons. We're taught not to expect any sort of convention. So even though this one plays out very traditionally, quite possibly predictably, we're not necessarily expecting that. And one aspect that this conventional victory tale does have for us is a genuinely satisfying and heartwarming end. I think Bubs' ending is probably the best of the bunch. Although we shouldn't...
Certainly the happiest.
Certainly the happiest. I mean, we shouldn't assume it's all going to be roses for him from now on, but it certainly ends in a very high place, high literally above the basement. Yeah, so it's a really good setup here. And I do love that speech from Dee Dee. Some really profound things being said. There's like that, you're basically making a list of everything you'll do when your inner addict tells you to. That's the part that I really like. And it really struck me the first time she mentioned it when I watched it.
And again, outside with Bubbles, we had this idea that not being able to feel, not having that kind of empathy was, even when he was at his most embroiled in his dope fiend game, he was never had a problem with empathy. Yeah,
Walon's pushing Bubs pretty hard, isn't he? Like, it almost feels like too much, but you have to remember that he's been probably going to these meetings for like way over a year. And Walon's now probably got to the point where he's really pushing him to make the next step. And, despite that, we probably shouldn't denigrate him. Think about where he's come from in Walon's original meeting in season 1. That's certainly what this echoes of, doesn't it? Remember the Mustard Seed group meeting in season 1, where Johnny and Bubs go as some sort of, conventional, out of habit thing for their police parole. It's a very, very different story here. Things have moved on a lot and matured a lot. And I love...
Might also help to provide, because we don't get a whole lot of it. It's more his Walon's position as a sponsor for Bubbles is only really touched on. We don't really see much of what I presume is the more, I don't know, I suppose not a great term for it, but like sort of bread and butter work that he does with Bubbles surrounding his addiction. And I think they go through the 12 steps, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
And they kind of share their experiences as having been addicts themselves. So we kind of don't really get a lot of that build-up. We just get these really important moments with Walon, like when he's after his bottom with Sherrod in season 4, and he comforts him in the waiting room. And here this is obviously a very important deep point for him at the start of this episode, where he's not able to share the story later at the meeting. So Walon kind of turns up for these important moments, but we don't really see a lot of that establishment of his work as a sponsor with Bubbles.
Yeah, it's certainly wise not to pass judgment, isn't it, really, when we don't know so much about what goes on in these sessions. I think that's a good point you make. And yeah, Bubs just not being able to make himself vulnerable to the guilt of this death of Sherrod, and it's going to come. I guess there's just no other way. Eventually Bubs is going to see that, but It's just step one, and it's cool to see how well he's known as well. Like everyone sort of knows him in the meeting and stuff, and he's known on the street. So good scene, good closure for Dee Dee. We see that she's been through a 3-year addiction process. Obviously, 2004 was when we first saw her, so it has been a fair while. It's been a good 3-4 years since we saw her for the first time.
Yeah. Very. It's great that the arc has been a very realistic amount of time.
Yep, definitely. Okay, so should we just do the second and shorter bit of the Bubbles strand?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Bubbles queues at Viva House, a community centre that offers free food to those who are struggling. He's greeted by one of the staff, Brendan Walsh, as he gets his seat. Inside, Bubbles watches a mother berate a screaming child. When she threatens violence, another staff member intervenes and tells her that violence of any kind is against the rules of the centre. Bubbles watches Dee Dee with her child as he waits for another Narcotics Anonymous meeting to begin. Walon again appeals to him to speak, and he declines. Walon explains that he thinks Bubbles has to do something with his time, even if it's not speaking at meetings. Bubbles later returns to Viva House and asks Brendan if he can help out. Brendan suggests that Bubbles serve food as it's more enjoyable, and Bubbles tells him that he can't. Bubbles instead gets to work cleaning the pots and pans.
Yeah, so Bubbles taking it out on himself, basically, kind of really pushing himself into cleaning those pots and pans and whatever, and almost not allowing himself the position of serving someone food, about doing this best part of the job. Like he almost clearly doesn't believe that he deserves to do something like that. He's pushing himself to the fringes, to the back where he can't be seen.
Yeah, he's using
sort of wallowing.
Self-loathing to get himself cleaner. It's good though. He obviously already hands out the paper, so it's not like he's doing nothing with his time, but I guess he does need a few more things to fill his day. And there's obviously quite a pivotal scene when he sees that girl being disciplined, that small child. I guess he sees that his next step to self-improvement is to become sort of one of the givers rather than one of the receivers here at the table, and I guess that's sort of one of the turning points in his mind as well that we see him go through.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point about him sort of going from receiving to giving. Yeah,
he sort of needs to just sort of have the compassion to get above that situation, really, yeah. Another little glimpse of Dee Dee with Dee Dee's little baby daughter. And Dee Dee's obviously looking very happy after having shared her burden. She's gone through the Bubbles process.
Yeah, he's trying to communicate that to Bubbles as well.
Yeah, that's like another turning point for him as well. The pressure is mounting, of course, Bubbles seeing this, but he still is not quite ready.
It's not going to be for another, 6-7 episodes yet?
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
I think that's about it for Bubbles for me.
All right, yep, same. Okay, let's go and see what the Davis detail are up to. So this is essentially the Major Crimes Unit with a little twist. They no longer have Marlo in their sights, it's just Clay Davis. And, of course, it's now just Freamon and Sidner, who are the two sole detail detectives.
New MCU light.
Yeah, MCU light is a good word for it. There's not many sections either, so it's all light. Freamon and Sidner prepare paperwork for the case against corrupt Senator Clay Davis. Sidner reviews Davis's method. He raises money for false community projects, and then the projects do not arise. Sidner asks who they are targeting if Davis can be turned as an informant. Freamon states that there is money in the paperwork that cannot be tied to campaign finance reports, and he believes that Davis can help them reveal where it comes from and who it pays. Sidner admits that he prefers street work. Freamon tells him that the interconnected nature of this case with the problems of the city is what makes it appeal to him. Sidner wonders what Marlo is doing now. They are not observing him, and Freamon predicts that he will be celebrating. Freamon sets up surveillance on a street and waits into the night. Eventually he sees Stanfield meeting with Chris Partlow and Snoop. After spending his own time on the Stanfield investigation, Freamon is late for a meeting with ASA Rhonda Perlman and Sidner. Perlman asks for the detectives to prepare their case by beginning at the periphery and working towards Davis to ensure they cover everything. Sidner asks her if she thinks Davis expects the indictment, and she tells him that Davis must have constantly feared it.
All right. So, yeah, we kind of start off with this review of the case moment between the two detectives, so that we, the audience, get an update on the Clay Davis case now that they're in full swing. Because I'm assuming that a small amount of time has passed here now that they've been reassigned, and they're kind of like, they've spent a bit of time getting a bit of groundwork down, and now we're kind of getting this review that they happen to be having at this moment.
Yeah, it's definitely a good exposition excuse, isn't it? Which it certainly is, but it feels like a very genuine one. And there's a sense that Sidner has just sort of, obviously he's technically been working on this case, but he's only just now started paying attention because he's no longer got Marlo to think about. So he's sort of having to learn the ropes as well and catch up with the audience. Freamon, of course, being on the other end of the spectrum and always being very on top of things, almost a superhuman level.
Yeah, Lester is a real professional here, jumping into the Clay Davis case without being too distracted by the Stanfield mess going on in the background. Obviously, he's not happy about it, but he's thrown all of his attention into this new case and is very much interested in getting it sorted as he talks. Gives that very impassioned description to Sidner about the interconnectedness of it.
Yeah, it really does sell it as like an exciting case, doesn't he? Like, it makes sense. And he just says he's just sort of this perfect human, like he never complains. Sidner, of course, makes a very good point that the street work is kind of more exciting, and Freamon instantly sort of knocks that down, shoots it down, and says, look, what we're doing here actually goes a lot further. I like the fact that he says that this is a case that actually everyone is vested in, everyone is complicit, because the money that is involved here is being paid by all of the city taxpayers. Like, it kind of affects everyone, not just the people in the ghettos. So he really does sell the scope of it. And of course, we know that Freamon is just as much into Marlo as Sidner is, but he doesn't make a big show of it, as he always hasn't done. He'll go off on the sly on his free time to go and do a little bit of on the low-down surveillance. So really not about the glory at all, and all about the realities of the criminality for him. He's very true to his word.
Just going back to what you were saying about Freeman's talk of discovering these webs of tragedy and corruption and how we're all complicit. That idea of us all being complicit is quite a key theme for the season overall. But it definitely repeats itself in this episode. This feels like the start of the theme here, especially seeing as I get a sense that over the course of the show, from season 1 to 5, we go from seeing a city that can't solve its problems to a city that can't actually understand its own problems. And especially in season 5, this idea of everyone being complicit is like one of the core reasons behind that. So to give an example, we have Steindorf mentioning that the whole world shines shit and calls it gold. Yes. Gus in this episode also talks about there not being a lot of innocence around. He's like, not a lot of those left around anymore, not a lot of innocence either. And in the episode before, we have Gus talking about people standing around watching a fire and about how people will gladly let this go on and they don't think it's their problem, but their inactivity is actually complicity to the problem.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually, yeah.
So this is like a kind of a big thing in this episode and part of the season's ideas of a whole about how Baltimore can't actually recognize, or certainly the Baltimore in the show can't recognize its own problems, and is not even capable of understanding them because of how involved everyone is without even realizing it.
Yeah, that's
I think
a really
it must
good
be
point.
someone else's problem, and it's not. It's to do with themselves as much as anyone else.
Yeah, that's a really, really nice point. Inactivity can be as dangerous as sort of negative activity, sort of thing. Yeah, so. Yeah, very, very nice. It seems like people do understand the problems a bit better now, but there's still no idea of how to actually solve them. Just a really good theme that certainly permeates throughout the season.
Definitely.
I like the bit right at the end of this opening exposition moment with Freamon sort of predicting the celebration that is transitioned into as if on cue afterwards. Makes a lot of sense. The end of the police surveillance. And then, of course, Freamon heads out on as he very much flamed earlier. He goes to watch Tater handing Pee-wee a vial on his own time. So he's certainly keeping his eyes open with all of his might here. And I like how they, as they often do with these long surveillances, they smatter the scenes around the episode to give us a sense of the real time passing, the Omar-like patience that Freamon has when he wants to have it. We get a few little funny moments as well, Freamon breaking out into song, and a few questionable parenting antics around just to keep people on their toes. So, good little bunch of scenes.
Yeah, he's listening to some pretty cool music as well. I heard some Janis Joplin.
Oh yeah,
where those kids are getting disciplined.
Oh yeah, he enjoys his surveillance. There's no doubt about that. And of course, he finally gets his payoff after the sun has set, and we don't have a clue who it actually is. It's all silhouetted, but we will find out the next day. And he tells McNulty that it's just the Stanfields, but things are slipping, things are out in the open, and it's very obviously drug dealing now.
Yeah, it's got to the point where they're recognising the patterns.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have that bit with Rhonda as well, who's very excited about the prospect of bringing this case in. And obviously, despite her problems with Lester in the past, she must know that she's in very good hands with Lester running this case, and that there's lots of potential here for a big win. And of course, that'll probably help out with getting Bond's profile that he wants. Does Bond run for mayor candidacy at the end of the show? I think he might do. But of course, this all feeds back into the whole FBI versus city local investigation, and it feeds into a lot of the politics already, this investigation.
Yeah. I suppose we look at that in a little bit, well, certainly in as part of what he's saying anyway, in the next part of the Davis detail where Clay is responding to what's going on.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Any more on that first bit of the Davis detail?
No, that's it for me.
All right. Okay, so we just got our one more bit, and it is a shorter bit. So, meanwhile, Davis has a tantrum in Commissioner Burrell's office. Davis demands support from Burrell, who explains that he cannot intervene with the new mayor and state's attorney involved. Davis reminds Burrell that he helped to negotiate a pay raise on Burrell's behalf, so that Burrell would have more income but would not lose his post to an outside applicant. Burrell explains that he would have to go around Colonel Daniels to interfere in the case, and that Daniels is loyal to Tommy Carcetti. Burrell reminds Davis that interfering in the investigation would be a criminal act, and Davis refuses to accept the lack of support because he supported Burrell in the past. Davis accuses Burrell of believing that he's finished, and threatens that he'll remember Burrell's attitude. William Rawls discusses their statistics with Burrell after the meeting, and explains that while the numbers are poor, they have already been manipulated as much as he dares, with City Hall expecting clean statistics.
Yeah, so quite a brilliant tantrum, as he called it, from Clay here, with his you think I'm done, don't
great.
you?
Such a sing-songy bitching session. He has like 3 or 4 of them throughout the show, and they're always...
It's a symphony of rage.
They're just always fantastic. And I love the way that Clay always demands things as if he has no understandings of the systems that are making him vulnerable. He just sort of says, do your thing, do some police stuff, and make it go away. And it's just kind of... Obviously, this is a very intelligent man, but it makes it all the more frustrating for the person who's being, crapped on here. Because even more of a powerful presence, because, it appears to be impossible to reason with him. He just sort of runs out having said not a lot, sort of. So it's... a very, very tricky situation with Clay.
Yeah. Do understand Burrell's position. He's actually kind of taking the moral high ground.
Yeah.
Unexpected thing for Burrell to be doing.
Yeah, definitely. So it's compared to Clay, obviously Burrell looks very clean as a sheet.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, and again, there's so many pressures mounting up that they're too scared to go to the mayor with the truth about the crime stats without being berated for it. We see that juking the stats is still a reality, but it's just become a new version of juking the stats, which means we juke it enough that it looks clean, or something like that. Yeah, I mean, they've got no money. They've been starved out of resources, so they've got necessarily no reason to be scared, but, Carcetti is asking for the impossible here. Yeah.
You're not able to do more with less, as we found out in more detail last week.
Definitely, yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's about it for the Davis detail.
Sure. All right, so let's move on to the Stanfields. We have 3 sections with the Stanfield organisation. We'll kick off with Marlo meeting with his enforcers Chris and Snoop. They have noticed that they are no longer under surveillance. Stanfield worries about cameras, and Partlow reports that they have had no further problems since the one they stole from the courtyard. Snoop is eager to get back to work. Stanfield orders them to assault Webster Franklin's drug-dealing crew because he refused to accept their package. Stanfield also orders the murder of a man named Junebug for bad-mouthing him. Next, he asks for the death of Omar for stealing from him. Snoop reports that Little has retired, and Stanfield tells Partlow to bring him out of retirement. He explains that he feels his crown is not worth much if his goods are being stolen. Stanfield asks Partlow about a task involving Jess at prison. Partlow tells Stanfield that he is on the visiting list and gives him the photograph of Sergei Malatov that he took from the courthouse. Snoop tells Michael Lee and O-Dog that they will now have to earn their pay.
Yeah. Marlo feeling in a very powerful position now, it seems. He's been released from the shackles of the Details Overwatch, courtesy of Carcetti and the city's budget. And now he's got these 2 new street-tested enforcers to aid in this bloodshed that he's ordering. At least 2 murders and a few rounds of hit and runs on a competitor's corner. That's a hell of a lot of bodies straight away, I think.
Yeah, it's straight back to business, isn't it? It's such a business-like meeting here, and kind of scary, but also endearing, as it always is with Marlo and Chris and the rest of them. They look so genuinely happy to get back to killing people, like vouching particularly for Snoop's eagerness here. Chris is, and they're both like really kind of celebrating, as Freamon said. So it is very cool. And
this celebratory violence that occurs later on results in a whole family going down, leaving a child for DSS, and that's just for saying no to their package.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. And actually, it was because Junebug bad mouthed him. It was.
Oh yeah, that's Junebug's home.
It was for even
Yeah.
less than that. Yeah, it wasn't. It was just for hearsay. They don't even
apparently talking shit.
Yeah, it's, as Michael rightly objects to, but we'll come to that. So this scene, I think, very much proves to us what you were saying last week, that whilst the Detail weren't providing any tangible results, they were acting as this very effective suppressant. And it does make you wonder that as the vacants are kind of off the cards now, they're going to struggle to hide their activities. And that certainly appears to be the case when they get down to their business.
Yeah, they don't hang about. They're not. They don't seem to be too concerned that it might be a ruse to get them to go, oh, we're not being watched anymore, let's go about things. It does feel like rather non-cautious of them to suddenly break into rampage mode.
It's true, but I was thinking about that, but in some ways, if you're not watching someone, you can't really set a trap for them, because the only way you can really monitor them without watching them is on the wiretap, and they're not on the phones. So obviously, because they knocked down the police cameras and stuff, unless they were to feel the police presence back on them, they're effectively able to get away with stuff. Obviously, there were lots of people that got murdered this episode, but there's no direct proof that Stanfield was involved because no one was actually following them. So I think in some ways that there's a bit more logic than we might have thought in it.
Well, that's just the thing, because I mean, I agree. You're right, but it's kind of, as they talk about it later on, it's not a logical kind of caution. I mean, they're going around killing people because they might have said something.
Yeah.
And Chris out and out says it's not about whether he did or didn't say it; it's about the perception of it. And that's not a kind of a logical approach to caution. It's just kind of this paranoia.
Yeah.
So I kind of figured that they might retain that here as well and wait a little bit longer, but they do go straight for it. But I guess it depends on what kind of action they're taking, and maybe that's the part of what makes Marlo and his organisation the way it is. It's just constant unpredictability.
Yeah,
I think you can simplify it into them being, killers, but that doesn't make them easy or simple to understand.
Certainly, yeah. And they obviously waited a good week or two, didn't they, to actually drop this normal routine? And yeah, they're certainly bloodthirsty, and they do have a very odd sense of logic, as you say. There's this real paranoia to a lot of what goes on, I think it's just as much about paranoia as it is about ego, but it is incredibly cold and brutal. It is cool how Marlo sort of drops these 4 items of business, and over the next couple of episodes we see each one of them addressed. We obviously have the Franklin's crew, which allows for a nice Boys in the Hood parody moment, and then the June Bug stuff a bit later on. Bring Omar out of retirement, which is odd timing considering it's been like nearly 2 years since Omar went on retirement. Why would he wait? Oh, I guess the police presence. Okay, yeah, I guess we can call it that. And obviously we know that since he's in retirement, it's those who are close to him back at home who are going to suffer, which is kind of the go-to hitman ransom sort of technique, I guess. And finally, Jessup, which we will address in our next section, actually, the stuff that Marlo sees too personally with Sergei in the prison, and we learned all about what he was doing last week with Sergei's picture. So yeah, it's good that they sort of very logically lay out their next moves.
Yeah, you're right. It's really, really well put amongst the other parts of the episode that they bring up these like 4 orders of business, and they are all covered throughout the episode. Yeah, it's really, really well done.
Excellent. Yeah. So should we see it's the Jessup section that Omar attends to. So Stanfield arrives at Jessup and is surprised to find Avon waiting for him instead of Malatov. Barksdale is amused by the moment and tells Stanfield that he will have to go through him to reach Malatov. Barksdale suggests that Stanfield plans to use Malatov to contact the Greeks and cut Prop Joe and the rest of the New Day Co-op out of the connection. He tells Stanfield that he is willing to forget their differences and will arrange the meeting out of West Baltimore loyalty, provided that Stanfield sends $100,000 to his sister, Brianna. Barksdale inquires after Stanfield's health otherwise, and Stanfield replies that the game is the game. Stanfield returns to the prison having paid the price for meeting Malatov. Barksdale presides over their exchange. Malatov is dismissive both of American prisons, Stanfield's bribery, and of Stanfield as a criminal. Stanfield explains his desire to contact the Greeks and offers to pass his money directly to Spiros instead of Malatov. Stanfield suggests that Malatov has nothing to lose by setting up a meeting, as either a successful business relationship could emerge, reflecting well on Malatov, or Vondas will decline the meeting. Kind of a win-win.
Yeah. So it's great to see Avon again for the first time. And this is the first time since the finale of Season 3. Mission accomplished. Yeah,
he is the first of many cameos this season, people that pop in for one episode just for the sense of completeness, I guess, to make sure that the world feels fully fledged and that everything's linked back to the stuff that was put on the foundations before it. And I think we might have to make a new section at the end, actually, for all of our cameo spots. But it's really cool to see him back,
Funnily enough, this springs to mind now, oddly, but I happened to come across my housemates watching Dredd, you know, the new Judge Dredd film that they did, I think, a couple of years ago. And Avon is in it.
Oh, okay. There we go. We were talking about what is he not in, or, you know, we couldn't see him in anything, but there we go. So, did you manage to catch a glimpse of his acting chops in Dredd?
Well, he's in it quite a bit. He's like a kind of fairly, not like a main character, but he features for quite some while as, I don't know, I think he's just some kind of member of the gang that they capture and take as a hostage. But I don't know, maybe I was a bit biased because obviously I knew it was Avon, but I'm watching Wood Harris's performance and I'm like, he's doing a good job. Like, it's quite a simple role, but he's fleshing it out through his acting. I don't know if that was like a totally biased feel of it, but that was how I felt at the time.
He was Avon, wasn't he? He wasn't Dredd or whoever he's playing. He was Avon, I guess, because that's kind of...
he was like a gangster or something. He was like that kind of character, but he was a bit more kind of like typical action movie gangster. But like I say, in my bias, I'm watching Wood Harris's performances going, he's doing a good job. This is good. And I admit my bias, and I enjoyed it nonetheless. Definitely. I actually quite enjoyed Dredd, I got to admit. It's very silly. It's very, very dumb action film.
Yeah.
But it's quite weird. I found it kind of trippy as a film. It was a lot of weirdness, more than I expected. I expected it to be very kind of by the numbers action, but it tried to go out of its way to make it a little bit more interesting, especially visually. So I don't know. I was somewhat titillated by it, so it wasn't a bad film.
Okay. All right. Well, plus points from you then on the Dread.
A thumb sideways for Dread.
There we go. I mean, in terms of Avon's performance here, obviously, I guess Marlo meeting Avon as I would have long thought it would have been on the wish lists of fans, because obviously there was a rivalry in season 3. The two never met. The closest they got was actually Marlo visiting Avon's court trial. And here they make it happen. Avon, of course, appreciates having the opportunity to exert some authority over Marlo. We really sense that he relishes his moment and his possibility of doing this here, even if it is for one sort of very brief moment of time before Marlo steps back out on the street and he is the king. And of course, he makes it very, very clear to Marlo, and he says, you know, you're what I might call an authority figure. I mean, no shit, Avon. Like, we can imagine that. So very cool. Doesn't feel like fan service at all. It's just a meeting that kind of needed to happen. Everyone would have wanted to see this, and it's kind of what we would have expected, I guess.
Yeah, we definitely see the old school meets new school of the street here. I think that Avon has that kind of old school cool about him as well, with the let me help you find your tongue.
Yeah.
Which is great, and he's kind of trying to make it all about this allegiance to the West Side, which is actually quite amusing.
Yeah, it's almost ridiculous
when compared to
isn't
someone
it?
like Marlo.
Yeah, I mean, Avon's opening lines are great, but then we realise that he's only on Marlo's side out of respect for the whole East-West rivalry, which kind of makes sense if you think back to like the season 1 basketball stuff. But compared to what's happened on the street since then, it seems so primitive, doesn't it? Like this territorial thing. The game has changed so much following what Stringer's laid down, what Prop Joe's laid down, and what Marlo's laid down. And this bygones be bygones things, it does seem a little bit silly. It certainly acts as a nice shortcut to Marlo being able to skip over to Vondus. But yeah, it's certainly interesting to see.
And of course, they're establishing dominance in their own little ways. Avon in the prison and Marlo on the street, whilst separated by this protective glass in between them, just to make the differences and the gap between them ideologically, perhaps one might say.
Yeah,
making it a bit more obvious.
Oh, definitely, sure. And of course, Avon just showing off even more of his family bond traits. Avon, getting 100k for Brianna, despite the fact that we assume their relationship is dead. I don't imagine Brianna's tried to make any contact with Avon. But, blood is stronger. Well, there's some sort of blood is thicker than water thing that Avon told D'Angelo in season 1, and he stays true to that.
So yeah, a really great scene there.
And I love how Marlo, to counteract the huge monologue from Avon, just says, "The game is the game." I guess.
Yeah.
Despite that, there is some mutual respect, which is good to see. Then we have round 2 in the prison, with Sergei present for this one as well.
That's right, yes. He eventually pops up after the money has been wired. And, it's... I really do love Sergei here with his, in my country, this is not prison. Although I have no experience whatsoever in that area, I do I find myself inclined to agree with him about it being nothing by comparison. There's something about the words Russian prison next to each other that is quite terrifying. So, he's quite a terrifying person. In fact, maybe one of the scariest person on the whole show, given just how brutal and kind of cold and lifeless he seems. He's just the ultimate bad guy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean...
with Marlo, we have a bit more depth because we discover his character more, but of what we see of Sergei, it makes him seem like a bit of a Terminator-esque figure.
Yeah, he's kind of like the Jaws from James Bond. He's just this unquestioning hitman, isn't he, really, I guess? Very loyal.
Yeah.
Looking a bit bigger, older, and wiser than we saw him in Season 2. And playing it, very hard, but very convincingly as well. And, of course, the Boris joke returns. We have to assume that Marlo came to that independently because he wasn't privy for any of the previous Boris jokes in season 2. So perhaps that's stretching it a little bit too far, but need a few running gags to make something nice and hilarious.
Speaking of which, Avon crosses the line into cringeworthy territory with his West Side sign that he gives to Marlo.
Yeah, I mean, it just underlines the kind of silliness of the whole, territorial pride thing that he was repping earlier. As much as it is who Avon is, it for some reason it just seems a bit silly at this stage in the show.
You're right. It seems silly, but it also got fewer people were killed as a result of it. There was more respect for people, whereas in this new game, there's no respect at all. But you're right. It does come across as silly, which is a strange thing to feel about something that was comparatively preferable on the street.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a difference between having a sense of a family unit on the street and using that as an excuse to, make amends with your worst enemy and get Marlo promoted up to Spiros. Potentially, if you're looking at it very critically, as a bit of a fast forwarding of the plot. There's not a lot done here to convince us that Marlo has really toiled for this moment to meet the Greek. Particularly with Spiros as well. Spiros is won over very, very quickly, despite being this really tough man. It doesn't take Marlo much, really. He says as many words as are needed, and Boris goes from hard as nails to completely won over within the space of about a minute. So, a good bunch of scenes. Love the cameos, but potentially a bit of a shortcut, narratively speaking.
Yeah, it comes across as quite easy for Marlo here, which is why I'm surprised to hear that David Simon was thinking how he didn't need the extra episodes that he might have had from the length of season 4, for example, with the 13 episodes. So, yeah, it does feel like a little bit of a rush to get him to that position.
It's lucky that it's disguised very well in the cameos. You're kind of thinking all about that rather than the plot being kind of shortened, perhaps. But yeah, it's definitely these first 2, 3, 4 episodes where we really see the concessions that were made, I think, in the timescales and doing the whole more with less thing. Here, certainly. Yeah.
So what's next?
It's the final Stanfield section. Monk, O-Dog and Snoop plan the assault on one of Webster Franklin's corners. Monk hopes to drive up to the corner and have the other disembark and kill anyone they can. O-Dog suggests taking a West Coast approach and attempting a drive-by shooting, having recently enjoyed Boys in the Hood. The enforcers fail to hit anyone, so they leave the vehicle and Snoop kills one fleeing drug dealer with a carefully aimed shot. She remarks that in Baltimore they aim to hit their targets. Snoop next accompanies Lee and Partlow as they observe Junebug's home. Partlow quizzes Lee about their rationale for watching so early and explains that he wants to avoid being surprised. Lee questions the need for the murder of Junebug based on hearsay. Partlow explains that it's necessitated by the impact of Junebug's supposed rumour mongering on Stanfield's reputation. When Lee remains unconvinced, Snoop shouts him down. Partlow sends Lee to the rear of the building and instructs him to kill anyone trying to escape. Snoop is dispatched to disable the nearby surveillance camera and then meet Partlow inside the house. The murder of Junebug goes as planned, however a child leaves from the rear of the house and Lee does not shoot him as he flees.
So starting with our Boys in the Hood scene, as it were, it's interesting we have O-Dog wanting to be like a movie gangster. And this bit here where they obviously have, they pass by and make a hash of it, don't hit anything, and Snoop gives them a lesson on what they do in Baltimore, which is actually aim properly rather than trying to be all flashy. And this achieves two things, really, because it shows how, it kind of shows how brutal the streets have become. There's no flash, there's just quick, calculated killing that they're trying to go for. In Snoop's technique, as it were, just get out, shoot them, get away again. They're not trying to pretend to be make a big show out of it. And certainly no flash is very much the Stanfield way.
Oh, yeah.
But it also shows us a presentation of realistic violence and how the idea of drive-bys and the kind of filmic action that we see is actually not only unnecessarily flashy, but actually less useful in real life. If your objective is to kill people, then if they're going to be running like that, then the easiest thing for you to do is to just get out and take the shot if that's what you're going to do,
Yeah.
rather than trying to drive by and do something impressive when you can't even hit anything.
It is almost funny when they do demonstrate what a drive-by actually looks like in reality, and it's just a bunch of shots that hit random things in the street. It's and then of course it takes Snoop a little while to set up her shot, but it does the goods, and they really do in this scene sort of, as you say, fly the flag for proud Baltimore marksmanship.
Yeah.
And certainly a nice little schooling us on how the Hollywood gangstering stuff isn't quite all it's cracked up to be.
Yeah. It moves us on to the next order of business that we have with Junebug, and this time it's Michael that's getting, it's kind of the protege here instead of O-Dog. And yeah, they're obviously doing a little bit more of that patience, and we see the extent to Chris's patience goes, where he talks about setting up, hours before he even has to, just so he can't have anyone setting up on him.
Yep, a very important lesson and piece of knowledge that Michael takes to heart and lives by from now on, doesn't he? Of course. It's instrumental in Snoop's very own death here, so a little bit ironic considering the setup. And of course we get, as we were saying earlier, that the whole doesn't matter if he said it or not, people think he said it. And again, like we saw in the previous season, there's the shot from the rear view mirror from Michael's perspective, where we only see Chris's eyes, we don't see his mouth or anything, and you can't quite tell what he's thinking when Michael is bad-mouthing Marlo, actually, like Junebug was. He's saying, why do this based on hearsay? And there is this sense that Chris is kind of looking into Michael's soul through the rear-view mirror, as he did in Season 4. And there's this sort of fatherly connection there. So it's hard to know exactly what he's thinking here, but he's certainly treading on thin ice. He's being a little bit insubordinate, doing a little bit of a McNulty thing, which in this line of work is generally a lot more dangerous. So already showing his independent streak and the importance of being true to yourself, rather than giving weight to what those around you say, and that's certainly Michael in a nutshell. And of course we saw that Marlo and Michael were very much compatible. They're very hard, they're very independent street people. He doesn't get rattled, being another important character feature. But they do have very different motives in the game, which are now becoming clearer. We're seeing the first frictions of those differing motives appearing. Michael doesn't want any glory necessarily, he just wants to be sufficient and to be happy in his own life with Bug. And that's really not what Marlo's looking for.
Just wants to be satisfied in his independence, I suppose.
Yeah.
I did also feel that what Chris is saying about doesn't matter if he said it or not, people think he said it, possibly a similar thought in the minds of the bosses at the Baltimore Sun when they're looking at Templeton's story. Maybe not consciously, but there is that element of it doesn't matter if this person said it or not. People think that they said it, or this contributes to the story, and as a result it's effective for what we want to achieve, which is, have some kind of financial success for the paper, notoriety, prizes, that sort of thing. So they have very different aims, of course, but I think the idea is the same, about the perception of what people have said, not the actual facts themselves.
Yeah. And that's the very thing that stops the system from actually fixing itself. Because people sort of believe what they're told rather than, sort of analyse the facts, which is what the show is imploring us to do, really, by existing. So it's kind of, again, one of those bits where it gets slightly meta, but...
I can't help but feel like that's a much, much better way of putting that point across about people believing what they're told. It's a much better way of putting that across than Norris's, Americans just believe what they're told. Like, it's just straight up saying that straight out. So.
Yeah, it's not an American thing. It's a bit of a universal thing, really, isn't it? But if you
it's certainly not exclusive to America. Definitely not.
Yeah, it's just essentially how developed your media system is, and how commercialized it is, and it all contributed. All at some stage, it will become. As the Wire puts it, this system. So yeah, it's a very interesting discussion they have with a lot, as we can see that we can connect to the wider themes of the show there, and we then have the actual raid on Junebug's house. We have kind of our action segment for the week. We see that they still have a trade in power tools. They may have ditched the nail gun now that the vacants are discovered property, but. Snoop does spend a little time disconnecting the police camera with a wire cutter of some sort, and a drill. I think it's a drill that sort of unnails the thing. So they still have their tricks of the trade.
Snoop demonstrating that it's very easy to take down a surveillance camera. Apparently, you just kind of cut a wire at the bottom and that's it.
Yeah.
You'd hope
Kinda
that they
makes
might
sense.
design it to be a little less easy to sabotage than that. But yeah, I mean, maybe that's how it works. Don't know. I don't know any better.
I can't think of anyone else in the street going out and buying a drill. You know what I mean? There's an element of long-term planning to that doesn't really go through most of the streets. So perhaps it is as easy as that. You just need to have the motivation to go and do it.
And then the actual sort of murders itself goes as planned as far as Chris and Snoop are concerned. We don't actually see any of the action inside the house, but on the rear we have Michael, again defying what he's been told and obviously not prepared to shoot that child. That it's just not about the principle of what he's been told. It's not about truly ensuring there are no survivors or anything like that. He's still got that empathy, and like you say, as we establish in the car, he just wants to establish his independence. He's not there for this glory of being some amazing hitman.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, yeah. Very, very tension-ridden scene. Definitely, as far as the episode goes, this is at the top, and there is that moment where it's not clear whether Michael's going to go and fulfill his mandate of technically shooting this kid. Of course, it makes sense that he wouldn't. It feels like the right thing that Michael would do here. But there is that moment where the show does show him like cocking his gun and aiming down the sights, and like, oh crap, this could turn really dark and ugly.
Fortunately, that doesn't happen.
And I guess this scene is instrumental in causing a nice three-way collision between the Sun, Homicide, and the Stanfields, where Alma comes to report on the murder. Greggs comes to investigate, and then of course Stanfield is there mopping up Junebug's body or whatever. So, yeah, nice little connection, but showing how everything's interconnected quite closely.
So, anything else you want to point out about our Stanfield organisation strand?
No, not myself. Anything for you, sir?
I don't think so. Ready to move on?
Yeah, alright, we're just going to go do the politics, which is our shortest section this week. It's unusual that politics is so short. It's, in fact, contained just within one scene this episode. So, Mayor Tommy Carcetti meets with his Chief of Staff, Michael Steintorf, also State Delegate Odell Watkins and Norman Wilson. Steintorf reports an improvement in school test scores, but Carcetti is exasperated that the return is not in keeping with the vast amount of funds he's thrown at the system. He's also annoyed by the prospect of becoming governor and his successor having an easier time as mayor because he has solved the fiscal problems from the State House. Wilson suggests that Nerese Campbell's recent problems with the newspapers linking her to corruption might prevent her from becoming mayor. Watkins relays that Campbell described the real estate deal with drug dealer Ricardo Hendricks as a holdover from the preceding Royce administration. Steintorf suggests that Campbell's publicity might cost Carcetti votes in his election campaign, as people will not want her to take over as mayor. Watkins asks them what is making the governor vulnerable. They have no strong suggestions. Carcetti realizes he is behind schedule again and leaves. Watkins wonders about the appropriateness of running for governor without completing your elected term as mayor. Steintorf tells him that it's not out of place with the rest of the world.
Carcetti obviously is now totally focused on this governor race. He says words exactly to that effect. Until we take back the State House, this city will starve, I think he says.
Yeah.
So all of these political conversations, and it's kind of a good thing that we only get the one scene of it, all of these political conversations have shifted from the city's problems, especially with Carcetti talking about all of these issues going on in Baltimore. They've just become the mayor's problems, all of these political conversations. What's up with Carcetti this week? Why is he having problems? Who has he not got leverage with? Where is the money going? And most importantly, how can he ensure his smooth transition to governor of Maryland? Yeah,
that's definitely, I think, the point that the scene's getting across. The whole mayoral thing is definitely in the past now. He's completely resigned to this governing position, and
he now fully buys this idea that he's the mayor now, but that doesn't mean anything. He's got to get to the State House in order to be of any use to the city. Yeah,
and he completely believes that until he gets here, there's no help he can provide for the city as the city mayor, which is just a ridiculous idea. But he has genuinely...
What does he think the position of mayor is for, if not that?
Yeah, it's incredible how Steintorf... I still blame Steintorf. Obviously, Carcetti is beholden to some sort of responsibility for his own actions, but it's crazy how much his judgment has been clouded, and he has lost sight of that original intent of what the position should be providing, that he was campaigning so thoroughly on in season 3. And it doesn't feel out of place. It feels like the sort of trap every single person would fall into, unless you hired a very unique and off the wall kind of bunch of advisors for yourself, perhaps. But it comes across as very believable, but also, again, as you say, frustrating. And thank God there's only one scene.
And Steintorf gives us that line in that it's in conjunction with our complicity theme about everyone shining up shit and calling it gold.
Yeah,
which is a bit of a nod, or perhaps a preparation for the very final episode where Daniel says something very similar about people shining up shit and calling it gold. When he's the deputy commissioner?
No, I think he's actually the commissioner. I think he's the police commissioner by the end.
Well, either way, he kind of says words to these effects, basically, doesn't he? He kind of talks about when they're trying to push that stat game onto him right at the end, and that he's not prepared to do. He kind of gives very much the same line. Daniels as that guardian against doing just that.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, yeah. And that's certainly something to look forward to. And another thing that I really like about this scene is we get perhaps one of the most literal story points about the bigger the lie, the more they believe. The journalistic way of putting that across with the story about Nerese Campbell in the paper. The story's not, the story's meant to be impartial. It's not there to denigrate her, but there's an implication there that this person should be despised for what's going on, whereas in this discussion it's made very clear that there's a complicated set of issues there, and this is a holdover from the previous administration that Nerese may not have had much control over, but nonetheless she's already been hurt. The public perception has been damaged based on this one report about an issue that was kind of, just put the bare facts down on page. So she may not become the mayor now.
Yeah.
So...
And again, part of that doesn't matter exactly what the truth is. The perception of what has happened.
Exactly, yeah.
Is what's causing the problems.
And for today, at least, the people who we would expect to argue the other side of this gubernatorial stuff, they're keeping Sturm. Watkins and Wilson don't say anything until everyone's left. I think Watkins does challenge Steintorf, personally. Of course, with the whole shining shit line, but otherwise there's not much of another side of the coin to see this scene. And of course he's running late again. The job is becoming more and more formulaic, and so much about keeping up appearances and attending these Prince George's County dinners with the various bigwigs and all the rest of it. Like, it's just there's no time to actually do your job. You know what I mean? That they certainly get that point across. Very, very well.
So just the one scene for the politics then. Anything else you want to cover for that?
No, I mean, just to add to the Steintorf line about shining up shit, I like how that makes it very clear that, Steintorf is just straight out going to show us that he's aware of the errors of his ways and everyone else's ways. Often when people do it, you kind of assume that they're not aware of that they're actually going against what the system is designed for, but here he is showing us that he's actually very complicit in understanding of what's going on, but he's in a system where it makes everyone who does it do it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a problem that people have resigned to not fix anymore.
So, like we say, only the one scene. I think it's probably for the best. Otherwise, we could find Carcetti kind of being presented as this very negative character constantly.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. I mean, he's seeing this governing position as the end point as well. Like, this is the destination for me now. And that's the other mistake.
What will the destination be once he becomes governor?
Exactly. You'd assume that if not careful, sights would turn straight towards a high-ranking federal government position, right? And Martin O'Malley, who Carcetti is based on, was mayor in Baltimore from 1999 to 2007, and he was then governor of Maryland from 2007 to 2015. And he announced his candidate for presidency in May this year, didn't he? So he's certainly got his sights set very high following all that. So yeah.
Right. So what's our next strand?
So the Baltimore Sun. We're going to do 3 sections for the Sun this week. So Gus Haynes regales his colleagues Jeff Price, Tim Phelps and Roger Twigg with the tale of a reporter upsetting ex-mayor Tommy D'Alessandro with constant follow-up questions. Scott Templeton arrives and Haynes asks him what story he's working on. He describes a heartbreaker story of a woman who died of an anaphylactic reaction to crab meat. She was a mother of 4 and her relatives are setting up a trust for her children. Templeton enters the building. Haynes remarks that there is not much innocence anymore. Phelps misses the days of statuesque blondes and buxom blondes appearing in the paper. So just our opening shot as we opened last week in the smoking area, and winding up as we often do halfway into a joke. One that we can probably guarantee David Simon heard or told whilst on the job, and too good of a story to check out, as one of the veterans puts it.
Yeah, that certainly ties in with the story that we have later on with Templeton and his somewhat questionable information that he gets from this EJ figure. Talking about a story too good to check out, his clearly isn't. He clearly hasn't thought about it enough to make it interesting enough. Instead, it just comes across as, just exactly what it is, very questionable, up for a lot of debate. Yeah,
it certainly makes a point that if you are going to make a story up, it has to be kind of an unbelievable story, so unbelievable that no one would ever check the facts, because, you know what I mean,
they don't want to ruin the magic of just how good it is.
Yeah, or they'd assume that this person wouldn't be so stupid as to make up such an incredible story. There'd just be an assumption that you'd be mad to do it, so there'd be no point to check. And obviously, Templeton's piece was very middling enough to be suspicious, but not middling enough to be exciting. It's nice that Templeton arrives back just as that line is spoken, just to underline the point.
And again, a little shout out for our complicity idea about there not being a lot of innocence anymore.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. It's all change. And Templeton's seafood piece sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Like, he has art, and I don't know why he's so desperate for another good piece as they show him to be the entire episode. If that is the situation right now, like, that sounds like a really good piece, and Haynes is very genuinely impressed as well. So again, just a bit odd, but fair enough.
Now, is it? It's never fully revealed by the show, but I think there is a slight suggestion that the death of natural causes that McNulty goes to see later on, it's suggested that is Templeton's mother of 4.
Oh.
It's quite a hefty coincidence. So it's, the fact that it isn't fully revealed is a wise choice if that is what's going on. I kind of got the impression at the time that this was being hinted at being the same person, and they died of natural causes. And I'm pretty sure they mentioned about them being a mother as well and being sort of middle-aged or whatever. So
that's really cool.
I remember that at the time. I could be wrong about that, but it's only really hinted at, so it's not a full reveal, which is, again, it's a wise choice because it's a proper coincidence, that is.
Yeah, it's good when sometimes you really want that conclusive evidence that it's a proper link, and then I think this is one of the ones where it's best left ambiguous. And maybe we should look up anaphylactic reactions and see if sort of shoving a pillow on your face is a common symptom, and then we might have some confirmation. But really nice. I hadn't considered that. Just overall lamenting the old days as we often see. Journalism is changing. Very much of the ilk of the scenes at Dolores' bar, I guess, in season 2, as the dinosaurs, have a nostalgia circle jerk over the more honest and physical days of stevedoring. It's very much of that, but in journalism circles. So
that's right. Yeah, like you say, just trying to recapture this magic of the past.
Yeah. All right. Second Baltimore strand.
Okay.
So, Haynes has to leave to attend a meeting on a school project. He believes executive editor James Whiting is hoping the story will earn the paper a Pulitzer. In the meeting, Whiting explains that he's looking for a Dickensian story, examining the lives of city schoolchildren and the ways the system has failed them. Staff reporter Scott Shane suggests that the children have been let down by many factors in their lives. Haynes suggests that examining the children requires an assessment of the deficient parenting in the city and the effects of the drug problem. Another reporter suggests that schools are a better subject because the problems there have the potential to be addressed. Haynes admits that they should critique the city schools and that they deserve criticism, but explains that he is worried focusing on that limited aspect of the children's lives would make the story irrelevant to its subjects and would require ignoring the wider problem. Templeton suggests that little context is needed to examine a single classroom, and Haynes disagrees. Whiting disagrees and champions Templeton's view, a story of limited scope. Haynes states his concern that their intention is to win a prize when it should be to address the problem. Whiting tells him that he knows the problems of city schools because his wife is a volunteer at one. He insists the story focus on tangible deficiencies and outcomes in education. His reporters again point out that resources are not the only impediment to learning. Whiting demands a one-sentence synopsis or budget line for the piece. Haynes flippantly offers a suggestion. Whiting is insulted and tells Haynes that he is looking for an educational project, not an amorphous series detailing society's ills, and that by including everything they end up with nothing. He suggests Templeton is the best person to write the piece. After the meeting, Haynes watches Templeton in conversation with Whiting and managing editor Thomas Klebanow. Haynes stops a reporter named Wootton and asks for statistics for her port story. Wootton warns Haynes that Klebanow is approaching. Klebanow suggests that Templeton should write the cover piece, and Templeton suggests a piece about a baseball fan. Haynes agrees and wishes Templeton luck. Haynes wakes up in the night, worried that he has transposed the figures Wootton gave him. He checks the figures with Jay Sprite and is surprised to find that they are correct.
A big old section there, starting with Johnny can't write because Johnny doesn't have a fucking pen, which I believe is the budget line that Gus offers to Whiting.
Scathing.
So we have them talking about the limiting of the scope, and a slightly bizarre idea of a Dickensian story that they're looking for. It's interesting because episode 6 is called the Dickensian aspect. But it's obviously mentioned first in this episode, and we see what struck me about this scene is we kind of see Gus and Whiting's opposing views about what makes a good story, and I kind of feel like this is also true of The Wire versus lots of other TV shows, in that The Wire wants to pour all of these details in, but at the same time, it undeniably lacks the same ratings as so many other shows, all of these other shows that have that limiting of the scope and that have that kind of budget line, if you will, this focus on a certain thing. It doesn't want to detail all of society's ills, which The Wire certainly has no problem in doing. And, you know, as much as there may be a school of thought that really values that, and Gus here is certainly the champion for that idea and is often been described as a bit of a mouthpiece for David Simon himself in the show, there's, like I said, there's no denying the fact that trying to include everything in that limits the overall impact of the show on a large number of people. There's no denying that it just doesn't have the same kind of viewership as so many other shows that are doing similar things in a different way. So this clash of ideologies is happening both on the screen in a narrative way, but also what The Wire is presenting as a show amongst the rest of TV entertainment.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's perhaps one of the most meta scenes the show ever does. It very much feels like it's...
I'd like to know how self-aware it was. I like to think that it was very self-aware, and they were doing it with that in mind, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, and both the arguments, both Gus's and Whiting's arguments, are equally valid. They're both very good arguments. And as you say, this Gus's side, it's putting forward the argument for why a show like The Wire needs to be here. And I think often David Simon says, and well, a lot of the, everyone who analyzes it says that the show is very good at demonstrating problems but not offering any solutions. And this is the closest I think The Wire ever comes to showing us what the solution is. And it's a big ask. It's a very big ask, but it's basically saying that you need to be able to educate people about the scope of an issue, and then once people are educated enough, they'll see the error of the current system's ways, and they'll start challenging things that they are told to believe. And then the idea of perception is knocked down, and the truth comes out. So it's something that's kind of impossible to actually make happen, but at least the theory of it is there in this scene, and Gus is fighting for it whilst Whiting is fighting for the self-preservation or the preservation of the newspaper industry, which is also a very important thing. So it's really hard to take a side. I think the show is kind of edging us towards Gus's side, but equally you could totally take Whiting's side on it.
Yeah, because one of the key parts of Gus's idea is about not being afraid of putting out criticism, and they want to critique the schools and be honest about it. And obviously Whiting, as we've already seen, is not the kind of person that wants to rock the boat and start pointing fingers. Doesn't consider that to be their job as reporters. Yeah, it's increasingly becoming about entertaining people and telling them things that are relevant to their lives, and obviously the Pulitzers. It's putting forward what a dying newspaper industry needs. And Templeton gets his moment.
Yeah, Templeton has finally got his in with the higher echelons of the paper. Just really good moment. Obviously, we spoke about the wider meaning of that in such societal terms, but the show as well. The whole show has been about a battle of these two things, the careerists and the rebels. And Templeton finally gets himself noticed in amongst all of this debate. And I quite like how within this segment, both the ills of the schools and the declining port cargo numbers are both brought up.
That's right, yeah.
Which are unfortunately falling further down at the port. These are two issues that we feel we know about, both statistically thanks to the newspaper, but also personally thanks to past seasons of the show, which gives us quite a unique perspective and kind of proves to us that The Wire has shown us to think about the issues more widely. This is not just a statistic. This is something that you now know enough about to think about and see past the statistic. So it certainly makes that point well. Definitely.
Again, I feel like we get a bit of Gus getting a bit too nice again with Scott. He's talking about he's quite happy to be all good luck to you.
Yeah, he keeps the open mind, isn't he?
It's just part of why he's seen as too clean a character.
Yeah.
Because later on, whilst he's on the phone with Jay, after waking up in the middle of the night, we see that he's obviously very diligent in his accuracy for his reporting. And he even gets told by his colleague that he's must be better than he thought. It's like a big slap on the back for Gus here about how good and diligent he is and how he has these strong values. And as knowing Wire watchers at this point, we're expecting something bad to happen, or we're going to discover something bad. There's no way people can get built up like this without something to come crashing down in some way. But it just never comes with Gus. Not for the whole season. He just comes out of it squeaky clean.
Absolutely.
This kind of got me thinking, do you think there are any other characters who come close to this? The only person I can really think of is Colvin, who comes fairly close to being sort of clean by the end of his run, as it were. An untainted, morally clean character.
From a personal standpoint, but the thing that makes Colvin compelling and not subject to the same scrutiny is the fact that his actions, legally speaking, are generally very unorthodox and, in the case of Amsterdam, illegal.
And there's a lot of stuff he doesn't consider in regards to Amsterdam as well, that the deacon brings up with him.
Yeah. So exactly, there's some social issues that he creates as well as the ones that he solves. And I think, despite from a personality standpoint, he is very clean, completely on level with Gus, I think. But I think it's that aspect of his work. There's sort of unconsidered consequences of what he does that really adds the complexity there that's needed. So he certainly doesn't suffer from that. Yeah. Of course.
And it kind of ends up being a bit of a, maybe a bit of a problem with Gus, that he does end up never really having this fall that one expects from characters being built up like this. So it's a bit odd to never have that come around.
Yeah, and as we'll discuss in the next section, Templeton has the same problem, but on the other side of the spectrum. I think that's the problem to the exact same extent. Particularly as we discussed, like, he's so desperate for this big story, despite the fact that he got this pretty decent seafood piece the same day, and there's just no real motivation to explain where these totally careerist moves are coming from. But yeah, I mean, that the problem is there's no backstory really. That there's no domestic life to show us the other pressures they're under. The closest we actually get, as far as the newspaper characters go, is this scene with Gus in bed with his apparent partner. I'm not sure who it actually is. This show doesn't spend enough time to show us, but that's the closest we actually get for any of the characters having a personal life outside the newspaper, and that's not what the show normally does. Normally we see glimpses that give us the insights that we want.
Yeah, we don't really get the same level of development because it's just the one season.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, it's totally limitations. I mean, it's not their fault, no one's fault really, but it is a limitation, and there is that, as you mentioned, that story with the fact-checking, which seems to be a bit of a classic nightmare that they're trying to demonstrate to us that, all journalists will suffer from at some point, or whatever, and this is, of course, used to contrast with Templeton's complete lack of concern over the honesty of his journalism. It's the polar opposite being pointed out yet again. And they oddly end that scene with him turning on his telly, and there's like a TV channel headline being spoken by a woman on some late-night news channel. And I was trying to work out the significance of that, and I think it says that there's a woman who recently died, and the most defining fact of information about her was that she had a 2005 gold Mercedes. So perhaps that was an indication of the quality of the journalism that was going on around the Baltimore Sun and what he was having to fight against.
All right.
But,
I didn't really spot that myself, but that's a nice connection.
any others for that bit with the Baltimore Sun?
Don't think so. No, I think I'm ready to move on.
Okay, so the final bit is going to be all about Templeton's day with EJ, apparently, and everything that goes on with regard to his story. And so he spends the day interviewing people about baseball at the Orioles Stadium, but struggles to find a suitable subject for his piece. When he returns to the newsroom, he tells Haynes that he interviewed a 13-year-old orphaned wheelchair user from the West Side named EJ. Haynes asks for further details or a photograph, and Templeton claims that the boy was injured by a stray bullet. Photographers were unavailable, and that the boy refused to give his full name. Haynes allows Templeton to start writing, but has another reporter, Jay, check the paper's records for a story about EJ's original injury. Haynes is unable to find the boy when he sends out photographers, and has no record of the shooting, so he confronts Templeton with the inconsistencies in the storytelling. Him that he needs more corroboration to print the story. Templeton gripes that he resents Haynes' implication that he's fabricating the story, and Haynes tells him that he's not implying anything but requires his reporters to maintain a standard of verifiability. Haynes is interrupted by the Whiting, who is pleased with Templeton's story. Haynes explains his concerns to Whiting, who tells him that while the lack of verifiability is not ideal, it's understandable given the situation, and that the story will run. Haynes accepts the decision and thanks Templeton for his work. The regional affairs editor, Beth, quizzes Haynes about his involvement with the baseball story, and he explains that Whiting prevented it from aggressively editing the story before he had even read it. She asks if Haynes was concerned by the lack of a full name and photograph even, and he tells her that he was.
Templeton not finding the story he was hoping for at the baseball game, kind of goes around talking to various characters, and obviously ends up with that rather humorous guy who kind of got the bit of a conspiracy theorist vibe or whatever from him. Fuck baseball, which is obviously not a line that Templeton is likely to go for his story.
Not really printable, is it, that line? Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that when he discusses this with Gus later and gives his whole story about EJ, it has all the hallmarks of a sort of Herc-esque lie about it all being very vague, and he only let me use his nickname, and Was he leery of meat as well? Was it Fuzzy Dunlop that Templeton was interviewing?
There's probably an equally odd acronym for EJ that he could fabricate, but yeah, it's.
I
weird,
just think
isn't it?
he goes very far, doesn't he? Orphaned wheelchair user, injured by a stray, couldn't give his real name. Definitely doesn't do himself any favors if he wants to make it believable.
Yeah, it's not exciting, but it has too many cliches to be believable, isn't it? And it's a very risky maneuver, certainly. But perhaps he is smart enough to see that Whiting is going to overlook these things for the sake of quality. Well, certainly literary quality journalism. But yeah, as you say, it's very brave. And we get a little montage down at the stadium. Starting with what may be a Gus Triando's tribute. I'm not sure because they have that statue of what we assume is like a veteran baseballer from back in the day. Potentially Gus Triando's. I didn't do any research, but be a nice callback for Herc there.
I'm sure we'll get an email at some point from someone who will be able to tell us who it is.
And he speaks to like a really, really, a stickler for Bradley Cooper, a real lookalike down there as well. I thought it was him to begin with. So obviously the whole point of the montage is to try and establish a motive for Templeton to make his own stuff up. And there really isn't an attempt at much sympathy here, is there? And his lack of patience just appears as greed and selfishness. This was perhaps their one chance to show the other side of Templeton, to flesh him out. And it's pretty wasted on a montage of him scowling and grimacing at what could be, quite good valid opinions to put in a paper. So yeah, it's just an odd choice.
Reminds us of Gus's point before about good stories. They come when they come. A lot of it is to do with your attitude towards the reporting and telling a good story out of its accuracy and its empathy. And Templeton's not approaching it with either of those things.
You need to have the Omar or the Freamon style of patience. Just sort of wait for it to appear, don't you, really?
You got to build it. You got to build the story.
Yeah.
As you understand it, in the same way that they build their case and they build their understanding of the workings of a drug crew, so must Templeton do the same with his stories. Well, in a sort of comparative way, anyway. Not exactly the same. Does just spend months and months, but yeah, it's kind of a similar principle.
Definitely, yeah. And so obviously, following the montage, Templeton comes back. Everything's painted with fairly broad brushstrokes here. We obviously mentioned Gus's bullshit detector ringing immediately, and it's actually almost cringeworthy to hear him state all of this stuff so straight-faced, and it sounds so obviously fabricated. But with Gus maintaining to hold out hope, he's still got the open mind for the moment. He's still being the good guy, Gus. And then Templeton suddenly being heralded. Whiting arrives, wouldn't change a word. These thin rationalizations for printing it being a legit piece. He's obviously, not going to say his name because he's scared of being identified as a truant. It's all very thin, very, very thin. So the two sides of the argument being very clearly defined here.
Exactly, yeah. Believable enough for Whiting, anyway.
You do have to wonder if Templeton sort of went around the chain of command to secure Gus's concerns being blocked out here. It's not clear whether Whiting just sort of managed to just happened to grab the story, or whether Templeton perhaps went to see Whiting first, did a Jimmy round the chain maneuver to ensure that Gus would be blocked out here. And that's certainly
it's quite possible, yeah.
Yeah.
So, any more on the Baltimore Sun?
Nope. I did like the scene at the end where Rebecca was like hutting Gus, as it were, sort of being a bit snidey, and so it's just a bit of a shame. And obviously, there's printing a story based on hearsay. It's sort of the journalistic equivalent of the June bug in the Stanfield world. So
it is, yeah. Doesn't matter if they said it or not. People will think they said it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it must be our final strand now.
Yes, that's right. Homicide. It's going to be our longest. We do have 6 sections. Then none of them are too long. So, starting off with Crutchfield reading from the paper and relaying the news that Carcetti has removed the cap on secondary employment for police officers. Bunk considers looking for a job. Jimmy McNulty asks what he can do, and Bunk jokes about his sexual prowess. Crutchfield offers a position as a security guard. Kima comments on the iniquity of being unable to get paid for solving murders when you can for watching property. Perlman arrives and asks about new cases. There is just one case. When Perlman calls the night slow, McNulty postulates that the murder rate will rise now they are not watching Marlo. Perlman explains that the police department, rather than the state's attorney's office, suspended the investigation. McNulty points out that the state's attorney's office did not object, just as they did not object to Parlow and Snoop's gun charge hearing being postponed twice. Perlman tells him that postponements are pro forma. Perlman leaves with a nod to everyone except McNulty. Greggs admonishes McNulty for attacking Perlman as she is not the problem, and he tries to explain his actions by telling her that he's tired of being messed around. Greggs answers a call and McNulty takes the case. When he leaves, Greggs remarks on his bad mood, and Bunk tells her that he's worried about him. McNulty cannot find the remaining available working vehicle in the department parking garage and has to walk up to the roof. When he gets there, he finds that the vehicle is damaged and that it has a flat tyre. He becomes enraged and kicks the vehicle, hurting himself in the process.
We're starting off with a little bit of a connection here again. We have Crutchfield learning of the cap going off secondary employment from the Baltimore Sun, or at least what I assume is the Baltimore Sun. Sort of tying it into the newspapers giving people information. And I think it's pretty funny about Bunk just gesturing to his crotch. That's what he can do. They are his skills.
Very Bunk, so classic. Just as Bunk is going back to his old ways of the big R stick, etc., McNulty very quickly back onto his. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's no humility there, but it's Bunk. Insubordination and complaints are the theme of the day now, and it's a more embittered version of Rhonda and McNulty's previous chat in season 1. When they had more of a shouting match actually back in season 1 about how everyone gets paid and everyone stays friends and everyone's got a future, and this is just kind of the more embittered version of this. And it's aired publicly, which is much to Rhonda's dissatisfaction.
Another part of about what's certainly McNulty expressing here about how believes that everyone's involved in it and the idea of things being pro forma and people sitting on their hands and saying that it wasn't me and that didn't come from my department or whatever. That's kind of part of the idea that McNulty is expressing here, albeit with very little diplomacy or tact. And that is that everyone is involved one way or another, even by their inaction.
And McNulty's making the correct point, but
badly.
Yeah, but badly. When everyone has jobs that are within their remit, they wouldn't want to go outside it, even if that's what it takes. But it's just, again, wasn't those lines. And there's some echoes of Bodie in there as well, with the frustration and the game being rigged line. He's now the third character to mention it. Marla, McNulty, and then Bodie. Characters from 3 different institutions in the show, all having the same reflections on the game.
Shiny shit or shining shit or however it comes around, depending on the context, gets another show off here from Greg. So she talks about standing around shiny shit and getting paid.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
And working murders and starve.
Shiny shit and getting gold rather than calling it gold. But
exactly, yeah. It's kind of a semantic field for the episode.
Yeah.
And then after that we have McNulty's the rage. The McNulty rage building.
That's right, yeah.
And of course he starts to give a fuck when it ain't his turn. And that's another nice nod to season 1.
So I assume that's a reference to both the chat with Rhonda and the fact that it probably wasn't his turn in the rotation to take the case. I assume he just jumped up, probably to escape his dissatisfaction more than anything, just to sort of put his head into something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I saw as well. We kind of have a complete lack of usable vehicles in the motor pool.
yeah, I mean, which Crown Vic is it? It's obviously frustrating that they haven't marked the keys out, and he has to work his way all the way up to the roof where he has a pretty nice view, but yeah, no satisfaction. And of course, just to stick a gun in the mud, they throw on More Than a Feeling on the radio just to underline the absurdity of the situation. You know, the most kind of positive outlook song versus the absolute pain of McNulty right now.
Perhaps it's a nod to his emotional state. Like, this is kind of the moment that he flips, and that this frustration that he's feeling, you know, it becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a catalyst for him to do something radical. It goes from beyond something that he simply feels to something that he's acting upon.
That's a very good point as well.
It feels like this moment is a bit of a point where he flips. He's realised about all this shit that's going on. The detail's been shut down. He recognises that it's all going on thanks to inactivity from people who are supposed to give a shit. And, of course, that means that he's going to start giving a fuck when it ain't his turn. And then when it comes down to him trying to do that and get himself involved in a case when it may not necessarily be his turn, he can't even do that because the department is so useless that it doesn't even have any working vehicles. So, yeah, I feel like the song choice here is a nod to his emotional state and the fact that he's going to go from simply being frustrated to acting upon those frustrations.
Yeah, it's really nice, and I like how also just on a sort of face value level, it just works as quite an ironic accompaniment to the actual angle of the situation. So yeah, it's really nice. And yeah, I mean, as you were saying, really, just building on that, this is the episode that they're really having to use to justify McNulty's divisive turn at the end of the episode, which you can almost feel the shark jumping in some ways. I can totally see why a lot of viewers would have lost hope or lost faith when they saw that, and they're having to spend this episode justifying it, really setting it up. A little bit like they did with Templeton as well this episode, but to a much less fleshed out extent. And this is, of course, step one. I think there's quite a few steps we can identify in this. Step one being the strings of dissatisfaction here with the car particularly, and with just everything, and the fact that he's angry. And I guess he took this murder because he perhaps thought he might have a belief that this next murder is going to be a Marlo-based one, since they now have the freedom to go and murder people again.
I think an important part of this comes down to McNulty's, I suppose he has like an addictive personality. I mean, I don't know the exact kind of psychology behind it, but he definitely has that kind of personality, especially for someone who has such a serious drinking problem, that he just slips down these dark holes of self-destruction and obsession and addiction. And I kind of get the impression, based on what I know about addiction, which is admittedly not a lot, but I kind of get the impression that the common perception is that if you have an addiction and you become clean and you recover, that it becomes more difficult for you to then become addicted again. It's almost like it's reset a certain amount of your tolerance to addiction. But as far as I understand it, the opposite is true, is that if you have a propensity to be addicted to things, then you can stay as clean as you want. But if you start again, you go straight back to almost the same level of addiction in almost the same amount of time, almost like instantaneously, because it's like you're going back to your old mode. So I kind of understand a lot of it. I can't say it's the same for everyone, but as my limited understanding, I see it as being more like you have a level of addictiveness in your personality, and that by sinking back into it and by indulging it, you retain the same level. It's not like it suddenly becomes magically harder. So like with Jimmy's drinking, he goes from being very clean to drinking very heavily all of a sudden. Well, it's almost like coming home. It's almost like a familiarity to him. And his approach to the case and his ability to act out and go above chain of command and become very disobedient and the like, he's able to slip back into that quite naturally, because we are to believe that he's done it for years and years, and that, if anything, the inconsistent part is the bit where he was behaving really well. So in a way, it makes sense for him to go straight back to that. The only difficulty is how extreme it is, and whether or not that's justified based on the limited number of episodes overall as season 5 is. But I do feel like there is an establishment that he is quite capable of going back to that level of obsession and addiction and self-destruction.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, certainly. In considering they only really use one episode to make this justification, it's done pretty well. They spend a lot of time focusing on it, and despite the fact that you can still feel someone jumping over that shark at the end, they did the best job I think they could have done to make it feel not like that. That you can suspend your disbelief to this extent that it is a McNulty-esque trait, that it feels natural. You know what I mean? And yeah, I think it's handled well.
But still, a lot of people are going to react much as Bunk does, and that is understandable.
Yeah.
That is very understandable. I can totally see where people come from when they complain about this, and I think there are a lot of very valid criticisms about that bit. Obviously, we'll get more to that final scene when we get there. But in terms of this being his catalyst moment, his switch-flipping moment, I don't think it's like there's no build-up at all and no justification.
No, the whole episode is a build-up for McNulty to this. Yeah. As we'll discuss further on.
So I do kind of reject any notions of him suddenly becoming X or completely falling away from his clean life and becoming this all of a sudden. Like it isn't necessarily all of that sudden, and even if it is, it feels somewhat justified and relevant to how his addiction supposedly works. Yeah.
Oh, for sure, certainly. Just before we move on, I'll quickly sort of bookend this with obviously they have that nice discussion about new jobs now that they have the cap on secondary employment is gone, and I would like to see just a tiny small sort of mini episode where Bunk is this suave owner of a high-end cigar shop on Baltimore Street. I could really see that being quite a humorous little occasion, and I could really see him in that role. He's sort of built for it. So
the Bunk is strictly a shirt and tie wearing.
Oh, he'd certainly live by that in the cigar shop, even to a greater extent, I imagine. Yeah. So that did get my imagination going a little bit.
Yeah.
So that was cool. Anyway, that was a very hefty section. Let's move on to the next one. So McNulty arrives at the crime scene by bus to the disbelief of the first officer, Bob Brown. McNulty explains that he couldn't find a working vehicle and didn't get a taxi without the promise of reimbursement. The decedent is a mother of 4 who was found in bed after not being seen for several days. Brown believes the death is most likely natural, but felt obligated to call it in because the deceased had a pillow over her face. McNulty suggests that he often wakes up with a pillow over his head, especially when hungover. McNulty waits for a report from the medical examiner's office. He stumbles across a county homicide detective named Kevin Infante, arguing with a new medical examiner. Infante's partner Nancy Porter recognises McNulty and explains that their decedent had probably overdosed and his body was wedged between a toilet and a wall. She tells him that the efforts of the paramedics to free the trapped body post-mortem have given the impression of a strangling. Fractured bones, bruising on the neck and around the eyes. McNulty is surprised to learn that post-mortem pressure on the neck can give the same effect as an actual strangulation.
Okay, so we start off with a nice little touch where McNulty is limping after getting off the bus, where he has obviously hurt himself kicking the cars, which is a nice nod.
Yeah, that's cool. And then Bob Brown back again, who was one of our key objectors last week in the Western District segment. Just pretty kind of laughing, as we will too, at Jimmy getting off the bus. And it's just a cool little sequence here, because it's the first time we actually get to see Jimmy actually working a murder, I think. Is that correct? Sort of going through the motions that one might do as a detective, and
alone, I think.
Yeah, just alone on just doing his thing, and it feeling a little bit more routine. You know, like he's just trying to get away from his problems here by working his job, and the fact that it's a fairly routine sort of accidental death adds to that sense. And I guess perhaps we saw him working the missing dead girl in season 2, but that was kind of in an unofficial capacity as the Marine patrolman, so that might be the only other example.
And as I mentioned earlier, they do indeed say that she's a mother of 4, this lady that they found. But it's never fully revealed whether or not it's the same person who died due to the anaphylactic reaction. Yeah.
No, that's a very cool point. I'd like to think that it is. Maybe they could have given us a little glimpse of Templeton just to confirm it, but that might have been too much.
Yeah. And then we end up with quite a controversial scene in the sense of where it is in the show and how it is put in here to enable the scene essentially gives Jimmy information that he can use for his fake serial killer about the bruising after death being misconstrued as strangulation. I mean, the scene by itself is fine, but we do get Porter, who is just a vehicle for this information for Jimmy.
Yeah,
and the whole him being at that place to get that information does feel quite contrived right from the get-go.
She's certainly a plot device. Well, she's not a character.
It's pretty kind of sketchy to fit that in there. And again, it's just one of those things that I do feel with a couple of extra episodes, these things are passed out amongst other scenes and other goings on. And as a result, they feel more justified because of the passing of time. Just cramming it all in one episode just makes it feel like a little bit more procedural and going through the motions to get to our end point, get to our goal, narratively speaking.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. With regard to other things we learn at the morgue scene, obviously there's the theme of more with less back again. The morgue is also under-resourced. Jimmy's having to waste his time waiting around for a cause of death. And we see the same room as we saw in season 1 with Dr. Frazier, and all these complete ambivalence that the detectives and the coroners have to these crazy torn open corpses, which is just kind of part and parcel of the job. And I do like the scene with Infante. They also take a moment to show us the harder side of the job, which is remaining honest about the cause of death, even if a detective was convinced or would like to hear that the cause of death was different, and corroborated more closely with their current findings. So it shows that every single profession has that struggle between staying true to the morals and giving in to the kind of commercial or the easy option. Do you know what I mean? So it's being resonated across lots of institutions, not just the main ones that we follow, which is a nice detail that they put in there.
Yeah, that's true. So presumably Nancy Porter and McNulty have worked together before. It's quite rare that we get these characters that we know well, especially in the case of McNulty, who we know very well, and we meet someone that they know that we don't, and we have this one scene with them, or well, I suppose 2, 1.5 maybe.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's all we see of them.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough.
So
he
it's
has
a bit of
his
an
little
odd
friends, doesn't
connection.
he? Fits and all that, but it doesn't feel quite real, does it?
I mean, we see Fitz across the whole show.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a bit more justified, and they have connections, and then they build that up a little bit to make it feel more part of McNulty's life. Whereas here, he just appears and disappears again and gives him this crucial piece of information in order for him to enact this serial killer plot.
Yeah, I mean, this is step 2. Obviously, step 1 was that turning point in the parking garage, but this is certainly, the dispute here allows Jimmy to get his sort of second pillar in the killer motive, the fake serial killer motive. So you can now cause strangulation marks post-mortem. You can kind of see the light bulb going off in his head here. It's all coming together.
And it's interesting that's just it. I mean, it shows how difficult it is to put together good TV entertainment and put together a good story, even if the ideas are solid, because the idea of how Jimmy learns this information is good. It's kind of an interesting way to learn it, and it is a good scene by itself. But just the way that it's presented and when in the chronology of the show it's presented causes problems for us as the audience if we're kind of analysing it in that way. So
yeah.
It's interesting that the idea itself is good. There's nothing wrong with how he finds this information out. It's just executed a little poorly.
Yeah, I mean, there's some elements that, in some ways, it's good because obviously he's got a good reason for being at the morgue, following the very sort of undetermined cause of death of this interesting pillow situation. But the actual execution, once he's there, it does feel quick, certainly. So it just. Yeah, I mean, you can't have everything. So we've got.
But maybe we're being harsh.
Yeah, I mean, you have
There's
to be.
There's the other side to it.
Yeah.
Watching The Wire, because of its obsession with all that detail and like Whiting says, when you try to leave all that detail in, you kind of end up with nothing left. It also means that when you do attempt to bring all that detail in and some small amount is missing, you really focus on that. You're really like, well, why has this not been justified?
Yeah.
Whereas you could watch so many other films and TV shows and have things like that pass you by scene after scene. So it's almost just like you feel like The Wire is betraying its values, and in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big a deal as TV entertainment goes.
Because that is one of the things that people who defend this season often use, is that the season in general is meant to feel a little bit hyper-real. It's meant to feel like a modern-day journalism article. That everything, you know what I mean? That's one of the defences that's used, and that's why this season opts for that. But, I mean, it's hard for us to say how intentional that was, but that's one way you can look at it, certainly, which feeds into what you were saying there. All right, so we've seen the first two steps in McNulty's motive for going into the whole fake serial killer thing. Should we find out what the third one is? Step 3, yeah. All right, so McNulty takes Porter to breakfast and then bumps into Lester afterwards. Freamon tells McNulty that he's been contributing to... my reading skills are gradually declining throughout the evening. Has been continuing to observe Stanfield and thinks that they are becoming complacent now that they know the constant surveillance has been withdrawn. Freamon suggests that with just a few more weeks of investigation, they could have the case they need. McNulty tells Freamon that Daniels was clear that he cannot give them any resources, and Freamon suggests going elsewhere. Later they meet with Fitz. They tease Fitz by driving away when he pulls his vehicle alongside them. Fitz asks them why they won't come to his office, and Freamon explains that they wanted to avoid signing in at the front desk. Fitz asks who they have upset, and McNulty tells him they are working on a case that Commander's closed down, the vacant murders. Fitz is shocked the case was closed and asks where the detectives were after their year of investigation. Freamon mentions Stanfield, Partlow and Pearson as their main suspect, and Fitz recognises the names. Freamon explains that they have no lab work or witnesses, so they began prolonged surveillance. McNulty tells Fitz that 2 to 3 weeks of FBI manpower could break the case, but Fitz reminds him of the policy about prioritising terrorism and political corruption targets. McNulty tells him that the groundwork is done and making the case would garner headlines for the FBI, and Fitz agrees to take it to his superiors. The detectives continue to harass Fitz by blocking his path as he goes away. Fitz and his supervisor Amanda Reese take the information to the Maryland District U.S. Attorney and try to convince him to offer support. He is dubious following his meeting with Carcetti last episode. Fitz meets with McNulty and explains that the refusal was triggered by the rift between City Hall and the U.S. Attorney's office. Fitz tells McNulty that he is still trying to understand the issue, but that Freamon will be unable to get outside support from any agency for the case for the foreseeable future. So
it's kind of like Freamon initiating a little bit here, saying that then we go elsewhere regarding the Stanfield case.
And that could mean the FBI, but it could also mean, like it's... Again, trying to establish motive, mainly for McNulty, but also
we
Freamon.
Find a way. One way or another, we find a way.
Yeah. And the lack of success with the FBI is very much our third step in establishing the motive. The ever-present argument about political corruption and anti-terrorism only. It's very rigid on that ever since the start of the show. And it's odd that the characters don't seem to have learnt that. They always go in with the hope that this time they might be willing to make the exception.
Not only that, but post-meeting, they are, they find out that there's some kind of problem between City Hall and the attorney's office, state's district attorney for Maryland, is it?
I think so. Yeah, he's the rather shady character we met last week. Yeah.
So yeah, there's some kind of problem between the two parties, and that this personal grievance or whatever it is, or as we know it to be like a sort of partisan-based,
that's right,
political partisan-based disagreement, that is standing in the way of putting a very, very dangerous man potentially in prison.
Definitely.
Obviously that's a major frustration for McNulty, who we know is quite obsessed with being able to solve these kind of cases and put the bad people away, even if it wrecks him in some way, just so that he can say that he did it and prove how smart and brilliant he is, and do a good thing in the process.
Oh, certainly, yeah. I think what Freamon says here as well is another big step in establishing the motive. Freamon makes it sound really doable, doesn't he? He says 2 to 3 weeks of solid, good, efficient investigation. That's all we need. The case is brought in. And it makes it sound like a really tangible thing to do, especially if the FBI won't be helping. As long as we can keep it under wraps for 2 weeks, then, we've got it. We're not going to think about the legal implications for what we've discovered illegally afterwards, but, there's this instant dying desire to go and lock him up, and that sort of takes over. That takes over both of them.
I wonder how Fitz has heard of Marlo, Snoop, and Chris.
That's what I was wondering, because obviously it goes against their policy of not really looking at drugs.
Their names ring out, he says.
I guess the 22 bodies caught enough national attention that the FBI did pick up on their names, perhaps, because there was a lot of murder involved. It wasn't all about the drugs, so...
They might have got some information about it, but because it's not what they're dealing with, they just didn't take it any further.
Yeah.
So that's possible. But it did have me wondering exactly how Fitz knew that, but
it's true.
I guess we don't find out.
Fitz himself, we haven't seen since season 3, like Avon, so this is his final appearance in the show, I think. So we can call him a cameo, I think. Our 3rd cameo, and possibly Amanda Rita's our 4th. Again, we see her from time to time.
Mm.
And then there's those weird patrol pranks, which feel a bit forced, but funny nonetheless. So when they start sort of blocking Fitz off in the car and the rest of it.
So yeah, this is like you say, this is like step 3 for McNulty as well, seeing the difficulty here. So this kind of sets us up as it continues on after the conversation that they have at the bar later on regarding the overarching injustices involved.
Yeah. Should we see what the next justification is for this, the next motive?
Yeah.
Okay, so McNulty meets Freamon and Bunk at a bar. They bemoan the political climate, making it acceptable to murder dozens of African Americans and not be pursued to the best of the department's abilities. Bunk characterised the vacant murders as misdemeanor homicides of young black males. They suggest that if victims had been white women or children, the investigation would be ongoing. Freamon suggests that if the annual homicide rate was made up of white victims, the city would be under martial law. McNulty believes there must be a way to get the funding they require, and Bunk tells McNulty that he should be able to devise a plan to get it. When McNulty begins flirting with a woman, Freamon remarks on his unfaithful behaviour. So, the next step in establishing...
we do get our epigraph here as well, don't we?
That's right, yeah. The next step in establishing motive as well, you kind of got to make it clear what's wrong with shutting down the investigation, make it morally correct to reopen the case under their own steam. A lot of these discussions they're having here about the morality of these misdemeanor homicides, as they put it.
And I think they raise a curious point about how if there were lots of white people being killed, would the government not send the army in or something? It becomes very questionable when you think about it. If there were these children or white women or tourists or whatever getting killed, that something serious would be being done. But instead it's just seen as like one of those losses, like an acceptable loss that we can move on from. That happened a year ago, it doesn't matter anymore. Let's move on to the next thing. So this is kind of the other catalyst, I suppose, the pure, potentially racially motivated injustice of it all.
But also calling it motivated isn't quite right, because no one is outwardly thinking racistly about closing down the case. It's just sort of this subconscious consideration. Again, it's a very complex issue, but it is good that they sort of do tackle it politically in this scene here, and we get our Aruba epigraph to sort of underline it. And yeah, again, it just sort of establishes more motive. It just makes it clear that it's morally wrong to stop doing this, and that they have every moral right to reopen it.
And in that story with Prez, the Wire has already somewhat covered the conscious and unconscious elements of racial attitudes.
Yeah,
So that kind of ties into it as well.
That's not what...
it's not trying to provide a definitive perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, Carcetti wasn't thinking with racism in mind when he actually designated the closure of that case.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But it's just the product of a number of things. Right.
So then we kind of get it pointed out to us rather obviously about McNulty flirting with those women, and Freamon sort of, doesn't he have a wife or some shit now? That's
it. Yeah. Not going to delve too deep into that one. Although Bunk does try to sort of get a gauge of the landscape, but that's in the next section actually. So should we quickly move on? If there's got nothing else to say about the...
Yep.
Okay, so the next day McNulty nurses a severe hangover and Bunk quizzes him about the state of his relationship with Beatty. Sergeant J. Landsman assigns a case to Bunk and McNulty despite the McNulty's protests. Greggs and Crutchfield are assigned the triple homicide case at Junebug's house. Officer Aaron Caster is managing the scene as the first officer and tells Greggs that the back door is open and theorizes that their suspect may have left from the rear of the building. Greggs corrects him. There are multiple suspects as there are both shotgun and handgun wounds on the victims. Caster reports that their cameras outside were disabled. Crutchfield remarks that the crime was carefully planned. Greggs hears coughing from a closet and finds a child hiding inside. She chastises the uniformed officers and carries the child to the rear of the property to avoid the media. We have our Junebug aftermath.
Yeah, that's right. So the first bit is McNulty and his hangover and Bunk asking him about the state of his relationship, just kind of following on from the night before.
Yeah, and our next step in establishing motive, give Jimmy a fierce, angry hangover. But
yeah, it's clearly not in a sober, rounded mind here. Not a good state of mind.
And in fact, the shirt he's wearing now becomes a little bit of a classic shirt because, as Kima points out, same shirt as yesterday, Jimmy. I think he remains in this very shirt. He doesn't leave this shirt until at least episode 4, because he doesn't sleep. Like, he's there. He's obsessed with inventing this serial killer, and we see him working frantically on it for the next 2 episodes. So it becomes a little bit of a mainstay outfit for him. This dark blue stripy shirt.
And then we end up following Greggs and Crutchfield as they go to the murder that we saw earlier, courtesy of Chris and Snoop at Junebug's house, and seeing how Greggs has developed as a detective. Her understanding of the scene as opposed to Casto, I think we've seen on a couple of occasions before, who's a fairly nondescript patrolman.
He's the guy who points up for north on the Colvins. Yeah, so he is kind of the fool guy. It's really brutal, isn't it? Some real guts hanging out here.
Not very often that The Wire goes for that many kind of, I suppose, special effects, as it were, to depict the violence. Yeah. But certainly goes for it here. It's a very, very brutal scene inside the house.
And finding the boy, Aaron Caster, has been a very ineffective first officer on scene. And I guess this is also instrumental. It serves another purpose. It's one of the things they do with Greggs this season is to get her to reconnect with Elijah. So this is certainly planting a seed in that respect, as she's clearly very distressed by the discovery.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good emotional pointer to what is to come.
Yeah. And she's, of course, wary of the media finding out and nervously waits around the back for a cage van to arrive to take the boy away.
I think seeing detectives or police or members of emergency services, whatever, sort of giving the brush off to members of the media is something that we do see a fair amount in all sorts of TV shows and police shows. But it's interesting that here we see both sides of the story, because we understand that Greggs may not want to acknowledge the media and get that involved. But we know Alma, and we know that she just wants to be a good reporter and find out what's going on in the city. And I don't know, I felt a little bit sorry for her when Greggs just completely ignored her. So kind of seeing both sides of that adds a completely different element to what would otherwise be just a bit of a cliche.
Yeah, and it's great that you brought that up, because it is, as we mentioned, that the newspaper did need a little bit of complexity, morally speaking, and this is the closest we get where we do feel for Alma here. as we've seen how difficult it is, and to really wait for that story to come along. And now you're going to starve her out, Greg's. Can't blame her. But if there's anything that adds credence to Templeton's arguments for fabricating stories, it's perhaps very, very sort of thinly this, that the police don't make it easy and they aren't open to discussion. But it does equally make it all the more important and rewarding to actually do the digging yourself. So this would be quite the story here if Templeton or anyone else, such as Alma in this case, were dispatched to discover it. But they're not going to get much info out of it. So
yeah, and the end result is this kid being left for social services.
Yeah, it's quite sad.
That's just
really.
kind of, that's it. His whole family is, I see it, just been killed. So there's that other kid that ran off. I don't know if this is meant to be the same kid or if that other child has just run somewhere. They've run to safety if they know where they're going or whatever. So yeah, it's a complete mess. Yeah. These kids have just been left with nobody.
So obviously there are at least 2 kids in the house when the Junebug shooting went down, one of whom escaped. We assume that perhaps Chris and Snoop weren't brutal enough to put it through them, which is at least some sort of a saving grace. Again, like Alma, we're kind of in the dark. We're not really aware of too much of what happened here.
Mm.
Okay. Any more on that section with Greg's?
No, I think that's it.
All right, final section and we're done. So Bunk and McNulty attend their own scene and the officer reports a probable overdose and explains that they are waiting for transportation. Bunk notices that McNulty is distracted and checks if he is all right. McNulty dismisses the uniformed officer and goes back to his car for a drink. When he returns, McNulty begins to disrupt the scene by knocking over furniture and knocking a hole into a wall. McNulty begins to rub plaster from the wall onto the decedent's clothes, and Bunk asks if he has lost his mind. McNulty crosses himself and then chokes the decedent. Bunk is unable to watch. Finally, McNulty offers that there is a serial killer in Baltimore. He preys on the weakest among us. He needs to be caught. Bunk tells McNulty he wants no part in his actions and leaves the scene. McNulty continues to distort the scene and moves the decedent into a face-down, kneeling position.
First off, before we go into the sort of depths of this, are we to assume that officer who's there on the scene, I don't know if they're the first officer, but they're clearly there and they've seen what's happened and have provided a possible cause of death, are we to assume that they just didn't come back to the scene and didn't tell anyone about it? Because presumably after this comes from this particular death, the whole fake serial killer thing, did that guy not go around and tell anyone, oh, I was there and the guy just overdosed? So, I mean, it's perfectly plausible that nothing could have came of that and no one believed him or he never mentioned it or all sorts of other possibilities. But I found it interesting that this guy will have seen the scene and had a kind of idea of what had happened there. And then it comes out that it's this serial killer. And I don't know, as the patrolman, maybe he doesn't know any better.
Yeah, I mean, that could have been a really cool out-of-the-blue twist to throw at us late in the season, wouldn't it? That this unassuming patrol officer comes up and fesses up to the truth of it. But,
yeah.
I've never thought about it like that before. I guess a lot of what the show tries to show us is that a lot of these patrolmen aren't, they're there to be the Western District boys. They're there for the busting of the heads. And that once they can hand over a case to a detective, nothing is within their remit. It goes out of their remit and they can go back to whatever they want to do, and whatever the detective deduces is what the detective deduces, and he has rank over him and the rest of it. And that would certainly be the counter-argument there that I might like to offer up.
Yeah, I mean, that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, he goes to get his coffee and it's out of his mind already.
Yeah.
But like you say, I think it would have been interesting if he'd been, gone off to and come back much later in the season and said, oh, well, I was there and that wasn't the case, sort of thing. But
that would have been really cool, actually. That would have been a great little twist. Because obviously they have to kind of damage... No, they don't damage Greg's character, but it's quite a bold move when they make Greg's the one who sort of grasses on McNulty. It leaves the relationship between those two on a little bit of an unknown friction. So, yeah. But, yeah, that's certainly a cool idea.
So, one of the complaints leveled at this serial killer plot and how it starts here is a lot about its believability, and we've talked a bit before about where some of the justifications lie. Obviously, people's opinions on them will differ, but we've obviously already discussed how it is somewhat established. It does have this step-by-step process. There are some justifications being made. Regarding overall believability, I think we should remember that Colvin effectively legalized drugs in several areas of Baltimore without telling any of his superiors, and it was this quite large operation that was being under the noses of all of the major institutions in the show. So I think it's more just the sudden arrival of this story that's the problem. It's not the actual idea of the story itself, especially when it ties into what you were saying earlier about the season is meant to be this sort of meta representation of the tabloid story and the limited scope, and how we are presented with something that's hyper real and meant to be part of this journalistic attitude or new journalistic attitude that is being tackled by the show. So I think the key problem is not necessarily the story itself, but just how suddenly it arrives.
Yeah, and you can certainly, again, we can possibly put a lot of that down to the time constraints in these early episodes. And we are to potentially to believe that there were no time constraints put down, and that this was what David Simon wanted. So yeah, it's weird because I think they do a good job of setting this up. Relatively speaking, like Jimmy does spend a lot of time being frustrated, and they throw down a lot of good reasons for doing this in many ways. But it does still feel shocking at the end, even though you know it's coming. Oh yeah. Because you've seen so many scenes of the show that are so procedural and so true to life and feel so authentic, this one moment, it does ask for you to sort of suspend a lot of disbelief. And as I've kept mentioning the whole jump the shark, it sort of feels like that's what that emotion of jumping the shark feels like when you're watching something. I think even though it recovers from that and actually justifies itself well, that moment in isolation does feel really weird in the context of the show.
Is it also potentially commentary on that complicity element of us standing around watching a fire? The fact that 22 people get murdered and have their bodies put in vacant housing and nobody seems shocked, but what Jimmy does here is sort of really reprehensible to us as the audience all of a sudden. So it's kind of these strange, this emotional disjoint between the things that are happening on scene. I mean, obviously, like what happens with Junebug's house, that's shocking, and it's absolutely terrible what happens with these kids being left behind with nobody and just left to DSS. But yet somehow the scene with McNulty feels more shocking because of how, like you say, it being out of character with this procedural scene that we normally expect from the crime scene, and they're going to figure it out, and instead he's desecrating this crime scene, and that becomes really shocking to us. So it's strange how these scenes can have a different effect on us depending on their context within the characters and where it is in the story, how suddenly it arrives, etc., etc. So really it just makes it a very, very complicated scene, and why there's a lot of different opinions about it.
Yeah, it may be just as much a pacing thing as it is a storytelling thing, really. But yeah, they certainly didn't ease us into it, and it is shocking. And of course, I guess we like to entitle this scene as Jimmy. This is lots of great noises that Bunk makes here, and it's kind of the end of the Bunk and McNulty friendship as well. Unfortunately, they're at loggerheads from now until the very end of the show. So if there is any reconciliation, we don't see it.
Yeah, it's quite sad actually.
It's good though. It's a good development. It's one of the Bunk's sort of objection to all of this is cited as one of the strongest parts of the season, and the fact that he stays true to it till the end, and it adds a lot. It speaks volumes for actually justifying it. It adds that element of grounded in reality. Do you know what I mean? With Bunk always fighting for that corner. So, yeah, I think it's nice to point out the similarities with the newspaper as well. It's a mirror of the Gus versus Templeton scene earlier. One character is disgusted at the attempt to fabricate an honest trade, and the other is desperate to do just that. And as McNulty says to Templeton later on, I know why I did it, to save the city from Marlo, but I don't know why you did it. Actually, in brackets, just as much as Jimmy does it to save the city, he does it to elevate himself. But he says to Templeton, "Why did you do it?" And that's a very good point, because they never address the Templeton motive like they do with McNulty's.
And that's not to say that there isn't necessarily a motive, because we can look at it in a similar way in that he just wants to, like McNulty, just prove how smart he is and sort of make everyone feel a certain way about him. Maybe he wants the paper to be a financial success and he sees this as being the way, but it's never really covered in any detail by the show. So as a result, we do feel that way that you describe about, well, what are the reasons?
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah.
It's not money, because Templeton did establish his position that Baltimore Sun just wasn't a very highly regarded paper. He wanted to go somewhere that was esteemed, where he'd feel like...
But this could be the story that gets him there.
Yeah. So, there is some sort of pursuit of, perceived importance, I guess, really, what it's all about, really, yeah.
Yeah, it's just not fleshed out enough in the same way that McNulty's are.
And of course, I like how they layer this scene. They flip back and forth between Bubbles in the kitchen, scrubbing, and McNulty, particularly when he's having a drink out of the boot of his car. They really layer these scenes together. And I guess you got Bubbles trying to get clean in the kitchen, and McNulty about to play in the dirt, and Bubbles being on his way out of the dirt. So I guess there's sort of a up and down thing there.
I also see that connection between the addiction, especially with the alcohol, about how Jimmy has kind of slid straight back into this terrible, terrible drinking problem. It has happened quite quickly. I do feel like that's something that Bubbles understands. Like, he can sense that if he were to ever go back into that temptation and into the dope fiend mindset again, he would settle into it really quickly and really easily, and in a way that obviously terrifies him, because he knows how low it has gone now. And with McNulty, obviously it doesn't have the same kind of fear, because he's just, again, dropping back into that familiar territory of just grabbing a drink, and now it's got to the point where he's just kind of drinking freely on the job. Yeah,
really nice parallel between the addictions there. And I guess a final motive for us, step 6 in the motive, as with everything with Jimmy, be drunk. It makes everything easier and more plausible. So they certainly nailed that one at the end there. But really, really nice.
And when we're not talking about some perfectly rational, sober, right state of mind character making this decision, certainly not.
Yeah. And I guess that begs the question, did they establish enough motive for this to be plausible? I guess we'll have to answer that question a bit later on when they fully flesh out the story, because they do a pretty good job of covering for this later on, even if it does feel a bit shocking now, I think, personally, anyway.
There's more to be said for it, certainly.
Yeah. Anything
else? That's it, isn't it, for the recap? Unless
you
want to pick up any other little bits from the episode as a whole?
No, not at all. I don't know about if you've got anything to say.
I think that's it, other than what we've got left for our final sections.
Okay.
You can go a long way in this country killing black folk. Young males especially. Misdemeanor homicides.
Marlo was killing white women.
White children.
Tourists.
One white ex-cheerleader tourist missing in Aruba.
Trouble is, this ain't Aruba, bitch.
You think that if 300 white people were killed in this city every year, they wouldn't send the 82nd Airborne? Negro, please.
So, title, epigraph, and then we'll quickly just go over the cameos. So, title being Unconfirmed Reports. What do you make of this one?
So we obviously have several connections to it. The main one being Templeton's report about EJ, and there being a lot of things being unconfirmed about that.
Yep.
We have Junebug supposedly going around chatting shit. Michael obviously questioning that. Has anyone actually heard him say this? Unconfirmed.
Yeah,
that doesn't matter. It comes down to that perception. Doesn't matter what people are actually saying. It matters about whether or not people perceive them as having said those things.
Very good.
And in the same way, McNulty's becomes this unconfirmed report as well with his serial killer. Are there any other examples that you can think of?
Yeah, there's another couple. The Davis detail, obviously, they know that there's money going in for community projects. The community projects never appear. They know, but they can't prove it. It's an unconfirmed report. And then also a reference to Bubbles. So everyone, or at least Walon, knows that he has a big story to share about Sherrod. But until they hear it from Bubbles, it's kind of an unconfirmed report. It's an unfinished, it's an unfinalized segment. So I guess that's two other ways you can kind of throw it in. It's a little bit more tenuous. I certainly agree with that. I can't really think of one for the politics, but I think everything else at least has some sort of connection to the whole unconfirmed reports idea.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just a lot of instances of that in the episode.
Yeah. And then we have the epigraph from Bunk. The only time that there's two in a row from one character, which is an odd choice. I feel like Steintorf perhaps had deserved his moment with the shit shining, but
yeah, that would have been a good good epigraph.
Yeah, not the greatest epigraph. This one really. We know Baltimore ain't Aruba. I guess it's just there to underline the whole political discussion that they were having. Really, doesn't really serve much of a wider purpose from what I can see.
Yeah, just the idea that in Baltimore, a special case, such a thing doesn't really exist in the same way, and that 22 people getting murdered and put in vacant housing doesn't qualify as particularly important for whatever reason.
Yeah. And then
there is a kind of this idea about the missing white woman syndrome. It's kind of this social science idea on discrimination, and that sort of a lot of media coverage of white middle-class women, there tends to be a lot of focus on those kind of missing persons rather than, say, young black males.
Yeah.
And that there's a kind of disproportionate amount of coverage for that particular demographic of people rather than, any other.
Yeah, the ones that sell the stories. So certainly feeds into that idea. I don't think it's a particularly kind of deep or resonating quote necessarily, but it's one that they chose, and it's Bunk getting two this time around. Also interesting how both these first two episodes opened with like a minute-long close-up on someone's face. Firstly, it was Bunk, and this time it was Dee Dee. I think that was a nice little... I don't know if that was just the way they wanted to do it, but there we go.
Yeah, going straight in with a character. First one we know very, very well, and another that we are less familiar with, but is recognisable.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to just introduce our cameos section, because starting with this episode, every episode from now will have at least one or two, fairly big characters coming back just to reprise a one-episode role. And we saw 3 or 4 of those this week with Avon and Sergei and Fitz and Amanda Reese, who came on for their last appearances in the show. So there we have it.
Yeah, we do get a few people popping up for, like you say, their final appearances or just little connections to earlier parts of the show, earlier scenes, characters all the way back to season 1. So yeah, there's quite a lot of them to come throughout the season.
And there are a few of them that I believe were meant to be fully fledged arcs, but that had to be cut based on lack of episodes. I believe Cutty was going to have an arc that carried on through this season, but they actually reduced him to a cameo in episode 5. So that's one change that I believe was made, and perhaps why so many of these cameos are present in season 5. Doing as much as they can with less.
Yeah, that's true. All right, so is that everything for episode 2?
Yes, I believe so. All right, we'll catch you for episode 3. Not for attribution.
Yeah. That's right, yeah, kind of continuing with our somewhat journalistically minded titles. So yeah, thanks very much for joining us again, And by all means, send us your emails. Thanks for everyone who we heard from this week. Send us anything, any of your thoughts on this episode. Obviously, this has got quite a few controversial moments in it, so I dare say we'll hear some divisive opinions about it as well. Just give us a shout at caughtonthewire@gmail.com and check up any details, any news, information about the latest episodes, and of course downloads and links to all of the episodes going right back to Series 1, Episode 1 at caughtonthewire.wordpress.com. So until next week, which will be the 11th of December for Episode 3,